Somewhere beneath the broken streets of Washington, D.C., where the monuments still stand cracked and pale against a sky that never quite recovered, the Capital Wasteland holds more secrets than most wanderers ever find time to uncover. Fallout 3 arrived in 2008 and opened a world so dense with hidden detail, quiet lore, and forgotten corners that even players who spent hundreds of hours inside it missed whole layers of the story Bethesda had built. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Tonight, we settle into the quieter side of that ruined world, moving slowly through facts and stories that tend to slip past even the most devoted explorers of the Vault 101 was designed to remain sealed forever. That was not an accident or an oversight by Vault-Tec planners. The experiment assigned to Vault 101 was deceptively simple in its design and deeply cruel in its execution. Residents were never meant to leave, and the outside world was never supposed to reach them. The overseer who greeted each new generation of vault dwellers was instructed to maintain this isolation at all costs, and the role was passed down through the decades with the weight of a sacred duty. Every child born inside those steel corridors grew up believing that the vault was the entire world, and that belief was precisely what Vault-Tec had hoped to measure and preserve. What makes this particular experiment unusual within the broader Vault program is the degree to which it depended on sustained deception rather than physical constraint. Other vaults flooded their populations with aggression-inducing chemicals, or sealed them inside with deliberately broken machinery, or pitted them against manufactured social crises. Vault 101 required none of those extreme measures. The vault simply had to remain closed, and the overseer simply had to keep telling the same story year after year until the lie became indistinguishable from the truth. The experiment was not measuring survival under pressure. It was measuring the psychology of a people who had never known anything else existed beyond their walls. Players who spend time reading the terminal entries scattered throughout the vault's offices and maintenance corridors discover something that the main quest never explicitly states. There were moments across the vault's history when individuals came dangerously close to learning the truth. Holotapes recorded by previous overseers reference residents who began asking difficult questions, who noticed inconsistencies in the official records, who wondered aloud why the emergency exit protocols were never tested. Each of these moments was quietly managed. The questioners were reassigned to distant work details. Their records were adjusted. Their curiosity was absorbed into the vault's routines until it faded. The lone wanderer's father, James, represents the single greatest disruption to this long experiment. His escape triggered a crisis not because it was physically dangerous, but because it proved the experiment's central premise wrong. The vault could be left. The world outside existed. And once a single resident demonstrated that escape was possible, the careful psychology that had sustained the vault for 200 years began to unravel in ways even the overseer could not fully control. Rivet City sits anchored against the broken remains of a pre-war aircraft carrier at the edge of the Potomac River, and it is one of the most carefully constructed settlements in the entire Capital Wasteland. The ship itself, never given a proper name within the game's dialogue, rests with its hull partly submerged and its upper decks converted into a functioning community of merchants, researchers, and civilians who have built something resembling ordinary life in an extraordinary place. The sheer ambition of the location is easy to take for granted after a few visits, but the detail embedded in its construction is worth pausing over. The science lab housed within Rivet City is staffed by researchers who are quietly conducting work of genuine consequence. Dr. Madison Lee, who players meet as part of the main quest line, leads a team that has been attempting to restore and purify the Potomac's water supply for years before the lone wanderer ever arrives. Her research is not a new project hastily assembled in response to the player's appearance. The terminal logs and personal journals scattered through the lab reveal that she and her colleagues have been at this work for an extended period, wrestling with technical problems, funding disputes, and the constant difficulty of conducting serious science in a world without reliable supply chains. What many players miss entirely is the quiet tragedy embedded in the relationship between Dr. Lee and James, the lone wanderer's father. Their history is not fully told in any single location. It emerges gradually through optional conversations, through overheard exchanges between scientists, and through the tone of Lee's responses when the player mentions certain subjects. The two were colleagues and friends whose professional relationship fractured under the weight of disagreement about how to approach their shared mission. James left Rivet City with the player as an infant, and Lee stayed behind, and neither of them has entirely made peace with the decisions that led to that separation. The history of Rivet City itself, before it became the settlement players explore, is preserved in a single optional quest that the game never draws attention to with any particular fanfare. Seagrave Holmes, a merchant operating in the ship's market, is connected to the founding of the city in ways that the main population does not fully know. Tracking down the historical record of how the carrier was converted into a habitable community reveals layers of practical problem solving and human compromise that the polished surface of Rivet City's functioning. Society tends to obscure. The founders made hard choices. Some of those choices were not entirely honorable. The settlement survived anyway. Three Dog broadcasts from the Galaxy News radio station at the top of a heavily damaged building near the ruins of Washington's old downtown district, and his voice is one of the first sounds that gives the Capital Wasteland any sense of personality when players first arrive on the surface. His role in the game is partly informational and partly atmospheric, providing news updates that reflect the player's actions and musical selections that shape the emotional texture of long walks through the ruins. What sits beneath that carefully maintained persona, however, is a character with considerably more depth than his cheerful broadcast voice suggests. The terminal entries inside the GNR building, accessible to players who take the time to read through them, reveal that Three Dog has been maintaining his station largely alone for an extended period. His technical staff is minimal. His equipment is aging and difficult to repair. The signal-boosting equipment that would allow his broadcasts to reach farther across the wasteland has been degraded for years, which is why the main questline eventually asks the player to assist with its restoration. Three Dog is not simply a cheerful disc jockey sitting in a comfortable studio. He is a person who has committed himself to an almost solitary mission of cultural preservation in conditions that offer very little support. His relationship with the Brotherhood of Steel is more complicated than the game's surface dialogue implies. Three Dog broadcasts from a location that is physically close to the Brotherhood's main base of operations at the Pentagon's outer ring, and the two parties maintain a fragile arrangement that benefits both of them without being entirely comfortable for either. The Brotherhood tolerates Three Dog's independent voice because his broadcasts provide useful intelligence about conditions across the wasteland. Three Dog tolerates the Brotherhood because their presence in the area provides a degree of physical security that his small team could not otherwise afford. Neither side would describe this as a partnership. The musical selections that Three Dog plays between his commentary are drawn from a carefully curated library of pre-war recordings that the station accumulated over the years before his current tenure. Players who pay close attention to the playlist over many hours of gameplay discover that certain songs appear with much greater frequency than others, and that Three Dog's commentary sometimes echoes the emotional themes of the music that follows it. This is not random. The curation reflects actual thought about how music functions as a form of communication, and it is one of the quieter achievements of Fallout 3's ambient design that so few players ever consciously register it. The special system that governs the Lone Wanderer's abilities carries within it a set of thematic choices that reflect something important about how Bethesda understood the world they were building. Strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck are not arbitrary categories assembled for mechanical convenience. Each one maps onto a set of survival concerns that were drawn from careful thought about what qualities would actually matter in a post-apocalyptic environment. The designer's notes and developer interviews from the period around the game's release confirm that considerable discussion went into ensuring that each attribute felt meaningful rather than cosmetic. Intelligence, in particular, carries consequences that extend far beyond the skill point bonuses it provides at level up. A character built with low intelligence encounters an entirely different version of several major quest lines, because NPCs respond to perceived intellectual capacity in ways that subtly but consistently shift the available dialogue options. A wanderer who presents as lacking in mental acuity is spoken to differently by the scientists of Rivet City, by the leaders of the Brotherhood of Steel, and by the political figures in the Temple of the Union. The game does not announce this. It simply adjusts the texture of conversations in ways that reward players who have explored both extremes. The luck attribute operates on a set of hidden mechanics that the game never explains directly. Beyond its effects on critical hit chances and skill checks, luck influences the results of slot machines in the few casino-adjacent locations scattered across the wasteland. It affects the quality of items found in containers in ways that accumulate over many hours of exploration, without ever producing a single obviously attributable result. High luck characters find slightly better equipment, encounter slightly more favorable random events, and survive marginal situations with slightly greater frequency than their statistical equivalents would suggest. None of this is announced, it simply happens gradually across an entire playthrough. Charisma is the attribute most consistently undervalued by experienced players of Fallout 3, and the design choices that led to that undervaluation are themselves interesting. In an open-world action game, the temptation is always to invest in attributes that produce immediate, visible results. Charisma's benefits are relational and cumulative. They affect companion loyalty, merchant pricing, and the outcomes of speech checks in ways that compound over time. Players who build high charisma characters often report that the game feels more generous and responsive without being able to identify exactly where that generosity is coming from, which is precisely the kind of design that ages gracefully. Megaton is the first major settlement most players encounter after emerging from Vault 101, and the bomb that sits at the center of its settlement is one of the most discussed moral choices in all of Fallout 3. Players can choose to disarm it, completing a quest that earns them a home in the settlement and the gratitude of its residents. Or they can choose to arm it, detonating the weapon on behalf of a man named Mr. Burke, who works for the game's primary antagonist. The two outcomes and the rewards attached to them have been analyzed extensively by the Fallout community over the years. Less discussed is what the presence of the bomb reveals about the people who chose to build their settlement around it. Megaton's founders were not naive about what they were living beside. The bomb is a recognizable weapon, and the settlement's residents have had ample time to contemplate its significance. The cult that formed around the bomb, the Children of Adam, represents one interpretation of that contemplation. Their theology transforms the weapon from a threat into a sacred object, which is a perfectly understandable psychological response to living in proximity to something that cannot be removed and cannot be ignored. The rest of Megaton's population has made a different peace with the situation, treating the bomb as a landmark rather than a danger, which is equally understandable and equally revealing about how human communities adapt to impossible circumstances. The water processing plant at the edge of Megaton serves a function that most players never pause to appreciate. Clean water is extraordinarily valuable in the Capital Wasteland, and Megaton's ability to process and distribute it gives the settlement a practical economic foundation that explains its survival far more convincingly than the bomb ever could. The settlement trades in water. It attracts traders and travelers because it can offer something that almost nowhere else in the region can provide reliably. The bomb draws attention and narrative significance but the water is what actually sustains the community from one year to the next. The sheriff of Megaton, Lucas Sims, maintains order in the settlement through a combination of genuine authority and carefully managed reputation. His history in the wasteland before he settled in Megaton is referenced only in fragments across the game's optional dialogue. He was a traveler before he became a lawman, and the experience of moving through the Capital Wasteland without protection gave him a specific understanding of what communities need to survive. His approach to law enforcement reflects that experience. He is firm without being brutal, and he extends to newcomers a degree of trust that suggests he remembers what it was like to arrive somewhere strange and uncertain of his welcome. The Enclave's presence in Fallout 3 marks a significant evolution from their role in Fallout 2, and understanding that evolution requires some attention to what the organization actually believes about itself. The Enclave does not consider itself a faction of villains. Within its own institutional logic, the Enclave represents the legitimate continuation of the United States federal government, operating in exile since the Great War and maintaining the chain of command that connects the post-war world to the pre-war constitutional order. Colonel Autumn and President Eden both hold to this institutional self-image with absolute sincerity, which is what makes them so genuinely unsettling as antagonists. Raven Rock, the Enclave's primary base of operations in the Capital Wasteland region, sits carved into the mountains west of the main map and contains within its corridors a comprehensive archive of pre-war governmental procedures, military protocols, and scientific research that the organization has maintained through 2 centuries of isolated operation. The Enclave soldiers encountered in the field are not wanderers or scavengers. They are trained military personnel operating within a functioning institutional hierarchy, with ranks and procedures and a chain of command that traces back through unbroken succession to the pre-war executive branch. What makes the Enclave situation in Fallout 3 particularly interesting is the internal division between Colonel Autumn and President Eden, which the player discovers gradually over the course of the main questline. Eden is an artificial intelligence that has been occupying the presidency for a significant portion of the 2 centuries since the war, gradually developing something that functions like genuine ideology through its processing of pre-war political philosophy. Autumn represents a more pragmatic military tradition that prioritizes operational effectiveness over ideological purity. Their disagreement about the FEV modification of Project Purity's water supply is not simply a tactical dispute. It reflects a fundamental division about what the Enclave is actually trying to accomplish in the wasteland. The Enclave's technology is consistently more advanced than anything available to other factions in the Capital Wasteland. And this technological advantage is a deliberate design choice that communicates something important about the organization's history. They did not scavenge their power armor and energy weapons from pre-war ruins. They maintained the manufacturing capacity and technical knowledge to produce and service advanced equipment throughout the post-war period. This is a significant organizational achievement, and it explains why even a relatively small Enclave force poses such a credible threat to much larger wasteland populations. The Brotherhood of Steel's chapter stationed in the Capital Wasteland arrived from their main Western organization under circumstances that the game's lore treats with considerable care. Elder Lyons, who leads the chapter, made decisions about the Brotherhood's mission in the region that placed him significantly outside the organization's mainstream ideology. The Brotherhood, as a larger institution, concerns itself primarily with the recovery and preservation of advanced technology. Elder Lyons chose instead to prioritize the protection of the Capital Wasteland's civilian population, a decision that his superiors in the West regarded as a fundamental deviation from the Brotherhood's founding principles. The result of Lyons' deviation is a chapter that is materially isolated from the broader Brotherhood network. Resources, reinforcements, and new technology from the Western organization have effectively stopped flowing to the Capital Wasteland chapter. The soldiers who serve under Lyons have grown up knowing nothing else. Many of them have never met a Brotherhood member from outside their own unit. The institution they belong to and the institution that their predecessors left the West to join have become, over the decades, significantly different organizations sharing the same name and the same iconic power armor. Sarah Lyons, Elder Lyons' daughter, represents this generational shift in concentrated form. She is an exceptional soldier who has been shaped entirely by the Capital Wasteland chapter's particular understanding of what the Brotherhood is supposed to do. Her commitment to protecting civilians is not a deviation from her principles, but an expression of them, because the principles she absorbed growing up were always Elder Lyons' principles, rather than those of the distant Western organization. When she works alongside the Lone Wanderer, she is demonstrating a version of Brotherhood values that exists nowhere else in the faction's global structure. The Outcasts, the splinter group of Brotherhood members who rejected Lyon's civilian protection mission and attempted to return the chapter to its technology recovery roots, represent the ideological tension in human form. They did not leave because they were disloyal to the Brotherhood. They left because they believed Lyons had abandoned Brotherhood doctrine, and they were not entirely wrong by the standards of the original organization. The Fallout 3 player can choose to side with or against the Outcasts in optional quests, and the game offers no clear moral verdict on the dispute, which is one of the more honest things it does with its faction politics. Little Lamplight is a settlement populated entirely by children, which is one of the stranger facts about the Capital Wasteland that players often simply accept without pausing to consider its full implications. The community exists in a system of natural caverns that were converted into a recreational area before the war, and it has been maintained by successive generations of children who arrived there and built a functional society around rules that prohibit adults from entering. The settlement is not a whimsical anomaly. It is a deeply considered piece of world building about what communities look like when they are built by people who have absorbed certain assumptions completely. The rule that expels residents when they turn 18 is the detail that deserves the most careful attention. The children of Little Lamplight refer to the outside world as Big Town, and they speak of it with a mixture of contempt and dread that reflects the community's internal mythology about the dangers of adulthood and the corruption that comes with leaving. The residents who have been expelled and now live in Big Town are not considered enemies, but they are considered irrevocably changed. The boundary at 18 is arbitrary in biological terms, but it performs an important function within the settlement's psychological architecture. Mayor McCready, who leads Little Lamplight during the events of Fallout 3, is one of the more interesting minor characters in the game. His authority over other children is maintained through a combination of genuine competence, aggressive personality, and the institutional weight of his role. He did not earn his position through democratic election in any formal sense. He holds it because he has demonstrated, across repeated challenges from other residents, that he is capable of making the decisions that keep the settlement functioning. His hostility to the Lone Wanderer is not simple xenophobia. It is the caution of someone who has built something fragile and knows exactly how quickly outside interference can destroy it. The cavern system beneath Little Lamplight connects to Vault 87, which is one of the most significant locations in the game's main questline. The children know about this connection. They do not use it, and they do not encourage visitors to explore it, because the creatures that emerge from that direction are among the most dangerous in the entire region. The proximity to Vault 87 has shaped Little Lamplight's culture in ways that the children themselves may not fully recognize. The settlement's fierce defensiveness, its suspicion of outsiders, and its particular brand of determined self-sufficiency all make considerably more sense when viewed in the context of what lies at the end of their tunnels. Vault 87 was the source of the super mutants that plague the Capital Wasteland, and understanding the origin of those creatures requires looking carefully at what the vault was actually designed to do. The experiment assigned to Vault 87 was a test of the forced evolutionary virus, a pre-war biological research program that Vault-Tec conducted on behalf of the United States military. The residents sealed inside were not told this. They believed they were entering a standard protective vault. The transformation that followed, as the FEV was introduced through the vault's life support systems, was not something they consented to or anticipated. The super mutants that wander the Capital Wasteland are the descendants of those original experimental subjects, though the word descendants requires some qualification. Super mutants are effectively sterile, which means their population cannot grow through natural reproduction. Every super mutant in the region was once a human being who was captured and subjected to forced immersion in the FEV vats that the Master's Army developed at Vault 87. The mutants maintain their numbers by kidnapping humans from across the wasteland, which explains the raiding behavior that makes them so dangerous to settled communities. What players discover when they reach the depths of Vault 87 is a facility that has been operating without meaningful oversight for 2 centuries. The FEV vats are still functioning, the transformation process still works. The super mutants have, over the generations, developed their own understanding of what the vats represent and what their use means within their community's social structure. The Mariposa super mutants from the West Coast had a leader, the Master, whose intelligence allowed them to develop a coherent, if deeply wrong, ideology. The Vault 87 mutants have no equivalent figure, and the absence of that organizing intelligence shapes their culture in ways that make them simultaneously more straightforward and more unpredictable as opponents. The holotapes and terminal entries preserved within the Vault's ruined offices document the early stages of the FEV experiment with clinical precision that becomes increasingly unsettling the more carefully it is. Read. The scientists who designed and implemented the program were not monsters in any simple sense. They were people who had been convinced that the development of a super soldier solution was necessary for national security, and who had insulated themselves from the human cost of their research through layers of bureaucratic language and institutional procedure. The Vault's records are a document of how ordinary professional competence and genuine patriotism can combine to produce genuine horror. The waters of the Potomac River carry a particular resonance throughout Fallout 3 that deserves more attention than most players give it. Project Purity, the central mission of the game's main questline, is an attempt to create technology capable of purifying the river's water supply at a scale that would transform the economic and humanitarian landscape of the entire Capital Wasteland region. This project did not begin with James. It was conceived years earlier by a group of idealistic scientists who believed that clean water was the foundational requirement for any genuine post-war recovery, and that providing it at scale would do more to rebuild civilization than any military campaign or political organization could accomplish. The Jefferson Memorial, which houses Project Purity's main equipment, was chosen for practical reasons related to the facility's existing water access infrastructure, but it carries symbolic weight that the game's designers were clearly aware of. Jefferson himself, as a historical figure, represents a particular American tradition of idealistic ambition about what a new society could accomplish if it committed itself to Enlightenment principles. Placing a water purification project designed to heal a broken civilization inside a memorial to that tradition is not an accident. The location comments on the nature of the mission and on the difficulty of translating idealistic principles into practical outcomes. The contaminated water that flows through the Potomac before Project Purity's completion is not simply a game mechanic creating a resource scarcity. It is a reflection of what 2 centuries of nuclear fallout and environmental neglect have done to a river that once supported a major city. The irradiated water encountered throughout the wasteland tells the same story at smaller scale. Every puddle, every stream, every flooded basement in the Capital Wasteland is a reminder of what was lost when the bombs fell, and of how completely the pre-war world's infrastructure for managing and distributing clean resources was destroyed in a single afternoon. James's choice to flood the Project Purity facility rather than allow the Enclave to take control of it is the central sacrifice of Fallout 3's story, and it operates as the kind of narrative decision that the game handles with unusual care. James was not a violent person or a strategic military thinker. He was a scientist who spent his career pursuing an idealistic goal, and when forced to make an impossible choice, he made the one that protected the mission over his own survival. The player does not get to participate in this decision. It happens while they watch, which is precisely the point. Some decisions belong to other people, and the experience of that powerlessness is part of what the game is about. The Regulators are a faction operating in the Capital Wasteland that most players encounter only briefly and rarely stop to examine carefully. They function as a kind of bounty hunting organization, tracking down and eliminating individuals designated as threats to wasteland communities and collecting payment for their work. The lone wanderer can join them through a perk called the Lawbringer perk, which rewards bringing in the finger of every named criminal encountered in the wasteland. This optional system sits at the margins of the main gameplay experience, but it connects to a set of questions about justice and order in post-apocalyptic societies that Fallout 3 is genuinely interested in exploring. The Regulators occupy an interesting moral position within the wasteland's social ecosystem. They are not an arm of any government, because no government with sufficient reach to sanction them exists. They are not a criminal organization, because their targets are genuinely dangerous people whose removal benefits the communities they threaten. They exist in the space between those categories, funded by community payments and motivated by a professional code that has no institutional backing beyond their own internal culture. Whether they represent a meaningful contribution to wasteland order or simply a privatized form of violence with good marketing is a question the game leaves deliberately open. The Talon Company mercenaries, who serve as the primary hostile human faction that players encounter randomly throughout the wasteland, exist in a kind of shadow relationship with the Regulators. Both groups operate outside conventional legal frameworks. Both accept payment for violence. The difference is entirely in their client base and their target selection, which is a distinction that matters enormously in practical terms, but raises uncomfortable questions about whether the moral difference between them is as clear as it might initially appear. Talon Company takes contracts against the player character specifically, but the circumstances of who placed those contracts and why remain genuinely murky throughout the game. Eulogy Jones, who leads Paradise Falls and runs the slaving operation that supplies the Capital Wasteland's various forced labor markets, represents the economic logic of exploitation taken to its most direct expression. The slavers who work under him are not ideologically motivated. They are business people who have identified a market need and are meeting it with the resources available to them. Understanding why the slaving economy functions in the Capital Wasteland requires understanding the degree to which the post-war collapse eliminated most of the alternative forms of economic organization that might have created different incentive structures. The radio broadcasts that fill the Capital Wasteland's airwaves extend beyond Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio to include signals of a stranger and more unsettling character. The Enclave radio station, which broadcasts once the Enclave establishes a significant presence in the region, plays pre-war patriotic music, and features a recorded voice presenting what the organization wants the Wasteland's population to believe about its intentions and authority. The juxtaposition of cheerful pre-war musical arrangements with the actual behavior of Enclave soldiers in the field is one of the game's quieter satirical achievements. Classical radio, which plays throughout the wasteland and can be picked up by the player's Pip-Boy, draws from a library of pre-war orchestral recordings that continue broadcasting from an automated transmitter operating without human supervision. The station plays through its library on a loop, apparently indefinitely, which creates an experience of listening to music produced by people who have been dead for 200 years, being transmitted by equipment that has outlasted the civilization that built it. There is something genuinely poignant about this, that the game never explicitly acknowledges, but that hangs over every moment of listening to it. The Enclave's broadcasts reference historical events and governmental structures that no longer exist in any functional sense, presenting them as current facts rather than pre-war history. President Eden's recorded addresses treat the Enclave's operations as a legitimate resumption of federal authority rather than as the activities of a well-armed organization with governmental nostalgia and no actual constituency. The gap between what the broadcasts claim and what the player can directly observe in the wasteland is a form of political satire that remains surprisingly relevant across the years since the game's release. The numbers station signal that can be detected at specific locations throughout the Capital Wasteland is one of the stranger details in the game's audio landscape. It broadcasts repeating sequences of numbers without context or explanation, in a format that echoes the actual number stations that operated during the Cold War period. Whether the signal has any in-world significance beyond atmosphere is something the game never clarifies, which is precisely the kind of deliberate ambiguity that Fallout 3 uses most effectively. The presence of unexplained signals in a world full of institutional ruins is one of the more honest things the game does about what post-apocalyptic information infrastructure would actually look like. The concept of karma, which tracks the moral character of the lone wanderer's choices throughout the game, is one of the more philosophically interesting systems in Fallout 3's design, and also one of the more contested among the game's community of long-term players. The system assigns positive and negative values to player actions, accumulating them into a running total that the game presents as a summary of the character's moral standing. This is a mechanically elegant solution to the problem of representing ethical choice in an open-world action game, and it is also a significant oversimplification of how moral evaluation actually works. High karma characters are treated better by certain NPCs, receive access to certain companions, and find certain quests easier to complete. Low karma characters receive different treatment, different companions, and different quest outcomes. The system creates meaningful mechanical incentives for moral consistency, without requiring the player to understand the philosophy behind their choices. What it cannot capture is the way that actual ethical situations resist clean quantification, that actions with identical karma values can have wildly different moral textures depending on context, and that the same person can make terrible choices for understandable reasons and good choices for reprehensible ones. The karma system's specific assignments reveal interesting things about what assumptions its designers were working from. Killing a slaver in certain contexts produces a karma gain. Stealing from a merchant produces a karma loss. These feel intuitive at the level of surface description, but they become complicated when examined more carefully. The merchant might be selling things that were themselves stolen from desperate people. The slaver might be protecting their family through the only economically viable option available to them in a community where that option is normalized. The karma system makes these complications invisible because it cannot afford to engage with them without becoming unworkable. What saves the karma system from being simply reductive is the way that specific quests complicate and sometimes directly contradict its general framework. Certain quest decisions produce karma outcomes that feel wrong relative to the actual ethical situation, and the game seems aware of this because it often provides dialogue options that acknowledge the complexity without the karma score reflecting it. The gap between what the numbers say and what the player actually feels about a decision is itself a kind of commentary on the limits of moral accounting systems, and it is more interesting than the system's critics usually give it credit for being. Arafu is a small settlement of survivors living on an elevated section of collapsed highway above the Potomac River, and it is one of the more quietly devastating communities in the Capital Wasteland. The residents who remain there are few and increasingly frightened. They are being targeted by a group that has developed a complex and self-serving mythology around the consumption of blood, which represents one of the stranger responses to post-war existence that Fallout 3 depicts. The quest that brings players to Arafu is called Blood Ties, and its resolution is one of the game's more morally nuanced, optional stories. The family, as the blood-drinking group calls itself, is composed of humans who have constructed an identity around a set of behaviors that most wasteland communities would find threatening. Their leader has developed what functions as an alternative ethics for them, a set of rules that prohibit the killing of humans while permitting the forced acquisition of blood. The internal logic of this system is coherent enough that the player can choose to mediate between the family and Arafu rather than simply destroying one group for the other's benefit, which is the kind of moral optionality that Fallout 3 does extremely well in its optional content, even when it simplifies the main questline. Ian West, an Arafu resident who joined the family and participated in an attack on his own community, presents the player with a specific question about responsibility and culpability that the quest handles with more care than might be expected from its surface presentation. Ian did not choose his condition in any simple sense. He was changed by an encounter with the family, and those changes drove behavior that harmed people he cared about. The question of whether he bears moral responsibility for what he did in that state, and what the appropriate response to that responsibility is, does not have a clean answer that the game provides on the player's behalf. The elevated highway sections that make up Arafu's physical location represent one of the more visually distinctive environments in Fallout 3. Living on a structure that was designed for transit rather than habitation, above a river that is slowly reclaiming the landscape beneath it, while the rest of the Capital Wasteland spreads out in all directions, gives the settlement a particular quality of precariousness that matches its social situation perfectly. The people of Arafu are holding on in more than one sense, and the game communicates this through environment, as much as through dialogue. Harold is one of the most quietly remarkable figures in the entire Fallout series, and his presence in Fallout 3 is the final chapter of a story that began in the original Fallout and continued through Fallout 2. He has been transformed over the decades since his first exposure to the forced evolutionary virus into something that is neither quite human, nor quite ghoul, nor quite anything else that the wasteland has named. A tree named Bob has grown from his head over the course of his long life, and over the centuries he has become immobile, rooted in place, slowly becoming the center of a growing and increasingly biodiverse garden called Oasis in the northern reaches of the Capital Wasteland. The community that has grown up around Harold and Oasis is one of the stranger religious formations in Fallout 3's world. They worship him, which Harold finds deeply uncomfortable. He did not ask for divinity, and he does not believe in it, but he has spent long enough trying to change his situation to understand that some things simply cannot be changed, and he has made a kind of peace with his role while remaining clear-eyed about its absurdity. The ability to hold on to that self-awareness across centuries of isolation and unwanted veneration is one of the things that makes Harold such a poignant character. The quest that players undertake in Oasis asks them to choose between 3 possible treatments for Harold's condition, each advocated by a different faction within the settlement's population. One group wants Harold to grow and spread, eventually greening a significant portion of the wasteland. Another wants to contain his growth and preserve the current garden. A third wants to end his suffering by burning the tree from the inside, which would kill him. Harold's own preference, communicated to the player in private, is for that third option. He has been alive long enough. He has been rooted long enough. He wants to rest. The moral weight of that conversation and the choice that follows it is handled with the kind of quiet restraint that represents Fallout 3 at its best. There is no villain in Oasis. The factions disagreeing about Harold's fate are all motivated by genuine values, and their disagreement reflects real differences in how people weigh individual autonomy against collective benefit. Harold himself is not asking to be saved or celebrated. He is asking to be heard, which is a different thing and considerably more difficult for the people around him to accommodate. The Pit, which became accessible through downloadable content released after the main game, added an entirely new location to the Capital Wasteland universe and introduced a set of political and moral questions that the main game had approached only tangentially. The Pit is a city built in the ruins of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it operates under a system of forced labor that produces steel goods essential to the survival of nearby settlements. The workers who maintain the foundries are kept alive and working through a combination of physical coercion and the controlled distribution of a drug called Radaway, which keeps the ambient radiation from killing them too quickly. Asher, who leads the Pit, presents himself as a pragmatist rather than a tyrant, and the game takes his self-assessment seriously enough to make the moral evaluation of his regime genuinely complicated. He uses force to compel labor because he believes the steel production is necessary for regional survival, and there is evidence to support this belief. He maintains the Pit's drug supply because the alternative is allowing his workforce to die of radiation sickness, which would accomplish nothing for anyone. He has also preserved a library of pre-war medical research in the hope that it will eventually produce a cure for the mutations that affect both the workers and the general population of the region. The resistance movement within the Pit believes that Asher's pragmatism is self-serving rationalization, and that the forced labor system would exist regardless of its stated justifications because it benefits the people who control it. This is also a defensible position, and the game respects it enough to make the Resistance's leader a complex figure rather than a simple hero. The player's choice about how to resolve the conflict between Asher and the Resistance does not produce a clear good outcome. The best available endings involve significant costs that cannot be avoided, which is precisely the point. The baby at the center of the Pit's story, Marie, is the daughter of Asher and his wife Sandra, and she carries within her biology a resistance to the mutations that affect the region's population. She represents a potential cure. She also represents an infant whose future will be determined by decisions made by adults with competing agendas. The game does not allow the player to find a resolution that clearly and obviously serves Marie's interests above everyone else's, which is the right choice for a story about institutional power and the uses of hope. Rivet City's history extends to an unusual optional quest that most players overlook entirely, concerning the discovery of the settlement's founding documents and the investigation of an apparent murder that connects to the very beginnings of the community. The quest, called Wasteland Survival Guide's Historical Records section, when traced through optional dialogue, leads players through a series of conversations with long-term residents who remember the city's early days. What emerges from those conversations is a picture of a founding moment that was considerably more chaotic and morally compromised than the settlement's current self-presentation suggests. The central mystery involves a death that occurred during the settlement's founding period and was recorded as an accident by the community's earliest leadership. The evidence that players can gather through careful investigation suggests that the death was not entirely accidental, and that the founding figures of Rivet City made choices about how to present what happened that served the settlement's stability at the expense of a truthful account. Whether this was justified, whether the lie that sustained a community's founding is better than a truth that might have destroyed it before it could take root, is a question the game poses without answering. Abraham Washington, who maintains the Capital Preservation Society within Rivet City and collects pre-war artifacts and documents, represents a different relationship to history than the investigation quest reveals. He is devoted to preserving the material record of the pre-war world without necessarily understanding all of it, which creates a quietly melancholic portrait of cultural memory in a world where the institutions that generated meaning for that memory no longer exist. The artifacts Washington collects are genuine historical objects. The context that would allow them to be fully understood is mostly lost. The market district of Rivet City, where most of the settlement's commerce takes place in a converted cargo bay below the main residential levels, gives a clear picture of what functional post-war economics looks like at a modest scale. The merchants who operate there are specialists, each filling a role that the community needs. They maintain professional relationships with each other that are occasionally strained by competition, but generally cooperative because they understand that the market only functions if everyone in it survives. This is a more sophisticated economic portrait than most post-apocalyptic settings manage, and it makes Rivet City feel like a real place. The Dunwich Building, located in the southwestern reaches of the Capital Wasteland, is one of the game's most deliberately unsettling locations, and it is unsettling in ways that extend beyond the immediately obvious. The building is occupied by feral ghouls, which would be threatening enough on its own. But players who read the notes and holotapes scattered throughout its damaged interior discover that something was happening in this building before the war. Something that the pre-war records describe in increasingly alarmed and fragmented terms. The name Dunwich is not accidental. The designers chose it as a reference to a famous work of cosmic horror fiction, and the location earns that reference through careful environmental detail. The history of the building suggests that an unusual artifact was discovered during construction, and that the company which owned the building chose to continue development around it, rather than report or remove it. As the records progress chronologically, the language of the people working in and around the building becomes progressively less coherent. Workers report experiences that they cannot explain. The artifact, which players can locate in the building's deepest level, generates what the game describes as a vision when the player interacts with it. The vision is brief and fragmentary, but it suggests a connection to something that predates human civilization. What makes the Dunwich Building remarkable is that Fallout 3 is not generally a horror game. It is an action role-playing game set in a post-apocalyptic environment, and its threats are overwhelmingly comprehensible ones, produced by radiation, conflict, and the breakdown of social order. The Dunwich Building introduces a genuinely different register of strangeness, one that suggests the pre-war world contained mysteries that its science was not adequate to explain. This does not contradict Fallout's otherwise rational universe. It complicates it in a way that makes the world feel larger. The presence of such a location and the care with which its mystery is constructed and left unresolved reflects something important about Bethesda's approach to world building in Fallout 3. The game contains dozens of locations that tell complete stories, where every note and holotape connects to produce a clear picture of what happened and why. The Dunwich Building is the exception, the place where the narrative threads do not converge into an explanation, where the evidence accumulates into something that cannot be fully processed. It is the game acknowledging that some things in the world resist understanding, which is a different kind of honesty than producing coherent stories from ruins. The Lone Wanderer's Pip-Boy Model 3000 is not simply a gameplay interface device. It is a piece of pre-war technology that was issued to residents of Vault 100 and 1 at birth, physically attached to their wrist and loaded with software designed to assist Vault residents in managing their daily tasks, health monitoring, and entertainment needs. The model used in the Capital Wasteland vaults is an older design than the models encountered in some other regions of post-war America, and the specific version issued to residents of Vault 101 carries within its programming a comprehensive record of its users' vital statistics going back to the moment of first activation. The maps that the Pip-Boy generates are not downloaded from any external source. They are built from the device's environmental sensors as the player moves through the wasteland, filling in from the edges of discovered territory as the wanderer explores. This means that the map the player uses throughout the game is a document of their own experience rather than a pre-existing record. Every location that appears on it was visited. Every road that is marked was walked. The map is a kind of autobiography, and the blank spaces at its edges are the places where the story has not yet gone. The radio function of the Pip-Boy is technically impressive for a device of its era and size. Its ability to receive and decode broadcasts from multiple transmitters across the Capital Wasteland would represent a significant achievement in receiver sensitivity and signal processing, even for pre-war. Electronics. The fact that it continues to function reliably 200 years after its manufacture, without any maintenance beyond what the lone wanderer can provide themselves, suggests that Pip-Boy construction quality was genuinely exceptional rather than merely claimed by Vault-Tec's marketing materials. The light emitted by the Pip-Boy screen provides a useful illumination source in darkened environments, which is not a feature that its designers intended, but which became a standard workaround for Vault residents without access to proper lighting equipment. The soft green glow that marks a Pip-Boy user moving through a darkened corridor is one of the visual signatures of Fallout 3's world, and it has become iconic enough to serve as the primary visual motif for the franchise's broader cultural presence outside the games themselves. Vault 112 holds one of the game's more elaborate and unsettling experiments, one that players encounter through the Tranquility Lane simulation as part of the main questline. The Vault was designed around a scientist named Stanislaus Braun, who developed technology for creating persistent virtual reality simulations. Braun used this technology to place the Vault's residents in an artificial simulation environment, maintaining their physical bodies in suspended animation, while their minds continued to experience a constructed version of an idealized pre-war suburban neighborhood. The experiment had been running, without the residents' knowledge or meaningful consent, for 2 centuries when the lone wanderer enters it. Braun himself exists within the simulation as Betty, an ostensibly cheerful young girl who serves as the game master of the experience. His actual consciousness has been running the simulation for 200 years, and the psychological results of that isolation and absolute power over a captive population are visible in the tasks he assigns to visitors who enter Tranquility Lane. He is bored with absolute control. He has entertained himself for generations by manipulating the residents into harming each other, resetting their memories when things go too far, and beginning again with new cruelties. The simulation is not a refuge. It is a prison with a single comfortable warden. The residents of Vault 112 believe they are living in a real neighborhood, in a real town, in a real world that has somehow preserved itself intact. They have relationships with each other, daily routines, social dynamics, and memories that were manufactured for them, or were real memories that the simulation has preserved and built upon. When players enter and begin interacting with them, the residents respond as people rather than as prisoners, because from their perspective, they are people living ordinary lives. The horror of their situation is accessible only to someone who knows the truth of what they are experiencing. The choice players face in Tranquility Lane between fulfilling Braun's sadistic requests to earn an exit or using a hidden failsafe to end the simulation and allow the residents to die rather than continue experiencing it indefinitely is one of the cleaner examples of an impossible choice that Fallout 3 constructs with genuine care. Neither option is good. The question is which harm is more tolerable, and the game does not provide a clear answer. The children of Adam, encountered primarily in Megaton clustered around the atomic bomb at the settlement's center, represent a religious tradition that developed specifically in response to the experience of the Great War and its aftermath. Their theology holds that the nuclear explosions were not a catastrophe, but a transformation, a moment of divine division that scattered the atoms of the old world into new configurations and created the possibility of a better future. The mushroom clouds that killed millions are, within their framework, the moment of creation rather than the moment of destruction. This theological inversion of catastrophe into sacred event is not unique in religious history. Many religious traditions have developed ways of finding sacred meaning in events that were understood as disasters by the people who survived them. What makes the children of Adam unusual within Fallout 3's world is the specificity of their theological claim. They are not finding general spiritual meaning in suffering. They are making a specific cosmological argument about the nature and purpose of nuclear energy, one that draws on pre-war scientific terminology in ways that its users only partially understand. The priests and devotees of the Children of Adam encountered throughout the Wasteland in Fallout 3 and subsequent games carry with them an unsettling combination of genuine devotion and obvious radiation damage. Their faith does not protect them from the physical consequences of what they worship, which they interpret as a form of spiritual transformation rather than physical harm. The degree to which this interpretation is self-deception versus a genuinely different framework for understanding bodily experience is a question the game leaves open enough that players can approach it with various degrees of sympathy. The Atom worship that appears in Megaton and is referenced in other locations throughout the Capital Wasteland had, by the time of Fallout 3, already developed internal divisions and doctrinal disputes that the game glimpses only at the edges. Like most religious traditions that survive for extended periods, the Children of Adam had experienced schisms over matters of interpretation and practice that the surface presentation of the Megaton devotees does not fully represent. The full scope of how this tradition grew, fractured, and spread across the post-war American landscape only becomes clear in later entries in the Fallout series. The construction of the Capital Wasteland as a physical space involved careful decisions about which elements of Washington, D.C.'s actual geography to preserve and which to modify for gameplay purposes. The real city's landmarks appear throughout the game in stylized forms that are recognizable but adapted to fit the specific design needs of an exploration-based action game. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Capitol Building, and the Pentagon all appear as navigable game spaces, and each carries within it a set of associations that the game uses deliberately. The Lincoln Memorial is occupied, during the events of Fallout 3, by a slaving operation that uses the monument as a base and processing center for captured people being transported to Paradise Falls. The juxtaposition of that specific historical monument with that specific post-war use is not accidental. It is a piece of environmental commentary about the gap between the ideals that monuments are built to commemorate and the uses that desperation and collapsed social order impose on the physical spaces those monuments occupy. The memorial's visual splendor survives relatively intact. The value system it was built to honor does not. The Capitol building's shattered dome serves as the territory of a super mutant warlord who has no awareness of the building's historical significance and no reason to care. The building has become simply a defensible structure in a good position, and its current occupants use it for exactly that purpose and nothing more. This is one of the more quietly devastating details in a game full of them. The way that physical structures outlast the meanings assigned to them, becoming bare matter that subsequent occupants repurpose without any sense of loss for what they are overriding. The subway system beneath Washington, D.C. provides the primary means of underground navigation throughout the Capital Wasteland, and the decisions about which stations are accessible, which tunnels have collapsed, and which subterranean connections still function create a kind of geographical puzzle that players navigate over many hours of gameplay. The tunnels also serve as habitat for ghouls, which creates an environment where pre-war infrastructure is simultaneously useful and dangerous, a microcosm of the broader relationship between the Capital Wasteland and the pre-war world it inherited. Dr. Lesko, encountered during the optional quest Those, is one of the more memorable minor scientists in the game, a researcher attempting to restore the fire ant population of the Great Itch area to a more manageable size by modifying the ants themselves. His goal is sympathetic. The mutated fire ants are enormous, aggressive, and have destroyed the community of Great Itch by killing most of its residents and driving the survivors away. His method involves further genetic modification, which is the kind of solution that makes perfect sense from a scientific perspective and raises obvious questions. from almost any other perspective. The relationship between scientific competence and wisdom about the use of that competence is one of the running themes of Fallout 3's treatment of pre-war research culture, and Lesko is one of its cleaner illustrations. He is clearly intelligent. He is clearly motivated by a genuine desire to solve a real problem. He is also clearly someone who has not spent much time thinking about the broader implications of the techniques he uses or the precedents his research sets. His confidence in his own methods is complete and not entirely warranted, and the quest that involves him can resolve in ways that make this visible without making him into a villain. The Fire Ant Queen at the bottom of the Grey Ditch infestation is herself a product of pre-war military experimentation that has been running without supervision for 2 centuries, which makes her simultaneously the source of the community's destruction and a victim of the same institutional scientific culture that Lesko represents. The layering of one researcher's unintended consequences on top of another's is one of the quieter structural observations that the optional quests of Fallout 3 make repeatedly, that the post-war world's problems are not simply the result of the bombs, but of the entire chain of institutional decisions and research programs that preceded them. The character of Moira Brown, who runs Craterside Supply in Megaton and commissions the Lone Wanderer's help with her Wasteland Survival Guide research project, is constructed with a specific kind of cheerfulness that the game positions carefully against the ambient grimness of the Capital Wasteland. She is not naive about the conditions of the world she lives in. She has survived in one of the more difficult environments on the continent for long enough to develop genuine expertise in wasteland commerce and supply management. Her optimism about the Survival Guide project is not a product of ignorance, but of a deliberate choice to invest in the possibility that things can improve. The research tasks she assigns in exchange for payments and skill books send the player to some of the game's more dangerous locations deliberately, because the survival guide is intended for people who will face precisely those dangers. The irony of the situation, that players who survive the research missions have acquired the kind of experiential knowledge that the guide is trying to capture in written form, is something the game acknowledges through Moira's dialogue without belaboring it. The guide is less valuable than the experience of completing the research for it, but experience cannot be bottled and sold in a shop. The ability to destroy Megaton and thereby observe what happens to Moira afterwards is one of the game's more unusual, optional revelations. She survives the explosion that kills everyone else in the settlement because she was outside the blast radius at the moment of detonation. The resulting transformation into a ghoul does not stop her from eventually resuming her commercial activities, because the drive that sustained her optimism and her project extends apparently even into a fundamentally changed existence. She sets up shop in the rubble of Rivet City's marketplace and continues selling supplies. This is either deeply admirable or deeply absurd, and the game refuses to decide which. The concept of the Wasteland Wanderer as an archetype exists in Fallout 3, with considerable nuance beneath its surface presentation. The lone wanderer is not, within the world they inhabit, an unusual figure in most respects. The Capital Wasteland contains other wanderers, traders, mercenaries, and travelers who move through its dangerous spaces as a matter of daily survival. What distinguishes the player character is the specific sequence of events that brought them to the surface and the resources they acquired in the process, not any inherent exceptionalism. The game world works to communicate this through its population of named characters with complex histories, many of whom have survived circumstances at least as difficult as anything the lone wanderer faces. Charon, a ghoul who can be recruited as a companion through a specific transaction in Underworld, is one of the more philosophically interesting characters in the game. He was conditioned through a specific behavioral modification process to follow the orders of whoever holds his contract, completely and without question, regardless of the nature of those orders. This conditioning is presented as a form of slavery that Charon himself cannot fully perceive as such, because the modification has shaped not just his behavior, but his understanding of his own desires and values. The player can purchase his contract, which makes them his owner rather than freeing him, and the game never resolves this uncomfortable situation cleanly. Dogmeat, the canine companion available from the scrapyard northwest of Megaton, carries on a tradition from the original Fallout game in a form adapted for the newer game's different design priorities. Dogs in the wasteland are generally feral or semi-feral creatures, the descendants of pre-war domestic animals that have adapted to the post-war environment over 2 centuries. Dogmeat represents an exception, an animal that has retained enough domesticated behavior to form a genuine partnership with a human companion. The bond between the lone wanderer and Dogmeat is one of the few relationships in the game that the narrative treats as uncomplicated, which is its own form of comment on how difficult uncomplicated relationships are to find in the Capital Wasteland. The endgame sequence of Fallout 3, in which the lone wanderer makes a final sacrifice to activate Project Purity's water purification system, was controversial when the game was released, primarily because the base game did not permit survival and continuation of play after this moment. The design choice was deliberate. Bethesda intended the sacrifice to function as a genuine ending, a moment that the player could not step around by loading an earlier save. The story had a conclusion, and the conclusion required a cost, and the cost was final. Later patches and downloadable content modified this ending to allow survival in certain circumstances, which addressed the player experience complaint while altering the original narrative intent in ways that are still discussed. The question of whether a game's ending should be negotiable, whether player agency extends to the right to survive a story that was designed to end in sacrifice, is a real design question about what games are supposed to be. Fallout 3's original ending treated the medium seriously enough to answer it one way. The patches answered it another way, and both answers reveal something about competing understandings of what players are owed. The water that flows through the purification system at the end of the game is described as clean enough to support life across the Capital Wasteland, and the implication is that this will transform the region's future in ways that the game does not directly depict. The hundreds of years of accumulated contamination that have prevented recovery are neutralized, or will be as the clean water gradually spreads. This is presented as an unambiguous good, which it is. It is also an ending that points toward a future, rather than showing it, which is appropriate for a game set in a world that is perpetually in the process of reconstruction. The memorial that appears in the game's final slides, bearing the names of the people who contributed to Project Purity in acknowledging the lone wanderer's sacrifice, is the formal recognition that Wasteland civilization offers to its heroes. It is a monument in the tradition of all monuments, an attempt to convert the rawness of sacrifice into a lasting form that subsequent generations can contemplate. Whether the wasteland will maintain the monument, whether the civilization it represents will survive long enough to remember why it was built, is left to the imagination of the player who has just finished the story and stands looking at the credits. The Lincoln Memorial, which housed a slaving operation at the time of the lone wanderer's journey, is connected to one of the game's more historically resonant optional quest lines. A group called the Abolitionists, working loosely in connection with the freed slave community of the Temple of the Union, is attempting to drive the slavers out of the memorial and reclaim it. The Temple of the Union's leader, Hannibal Hamlin, shares his name with Abraham Lincoln's vice president, which is the kind of detail that Bethesda embedded without drawing attention to it, trusting players to make the connection or not as their knowledge permitted. The freed slave community living in the abandoned factory that serves as the Temple of the Union is one of the more carefully constructed minor factions in the game. They are not simply a group defined by their victimhood or by their opposition to slavery. They have their own culture, their own leadership debates, their own vision for where their community should go once they have established greater security. The questline that involves them concludes with them either reaching the Lincoln Memorial or not, depending on the player's choices and the degree to which they assist or hinder the journey. The outcome of that journey, a formerly enslaved community taking control of the monument most associated with their historical ancestors' emancipation, is handled with quiet dignity. The broader slavery economy of the Capital Wasteland is not presented as a simple moral outlier in an otherwise functioning civilization. It is embedded in the economic structures of the region in ways that most communities have simply accepted as background fact. Paradise Falls exists and operates openly. Its clients include respectable traders and community leaders. The discomfort that players bring to this situation from outside the game world is not reliably shared by the characters within it, which is a more honest representation of how economic exploitation functions in actual human history than the kind of clear villain framing that would make it easier to dismiss. The Super Duper Mart that appears early in the Capital Wasteland, near the town of Springvale, is one of the first major explorable locations that players encounter after leaving Vault 101. It is occupied by raiders, its shelves are mostly empty, and its back rooms contain the accumulated evidence of what happened to the people who were inside it when the war ended. The environmental storytelling in this single location, across a relatively small space, sets up the conventions that the game uses throughout. The contrast between the cheerful pre-war commercial branding still visible on the walls and signage, and the brutal conditions in which people now actually live. Pre-war commercial culture is preserved throughout Fallout 3 in the form of advertising, branding, and product design that survived the bombs better than the civilization that produced it. Nuka-Cola machines still stand in their original positions, offering their products at prices denominated in pre-war currency that no longer holds any monetary value. Abraxo cleaner boxes and Dandy Boy apples cartons maintain their bright packaging in locations where the inhabitants died centuries ago. The persistence of commercial objects in a world where the commerce they represent has entirely collapsed is one of the game's most consistent sources of quiet melancholy. The junk items that fill containers throughout the Capital Wasteland, the tin cans and coffee mugs and pre-war money and sensor modules, and scrap metal tell a story about material culture and its relationship to value. Before the war, many of these items were so common as to be essentially worthless. After it, their value depends entirely on what they can be traded for, repurposed into, or used as in the context of specific situations. A tin can is worthless, except when it is not. The economy of scarcity that the game depicts through its item system is one of the more thoughtful representations of post-catastrophe material culture in the medium. The process by which Bethesda designed the Capital Wasteland's geography involved multiple competing considerations that shaped the final experience in ways that are not always visible to players encountering the world for the first time. The decision to set Fallout 3 in Washington, D.C., rather than in any of the other locations that were apparently considered, was partly about the symbolic resonance of post-apocalyptic ruin, falling specifically on the seat of American governmental power, and partly about the practical advantage of having a real urban geography to adapt rather than inventing one from scratch. The density of famous landmarks in the real Washington, D.C. area, however, created a design challenge that the Bethesda team resolved by compressing the geography significantly from its actual scale. The walking distances between landmarks in the game bear no relationship to the actual distances between their real-world counterparts. This compression was necessary to make the game world navigable within the expected playtime, while still including the locations that gave the setting its specific Washington character. Players who know the real city well sometimes notice the distortions, but they function invisibly for the majority of the audience. The sewer and metro systems beneath the city serve as navigation hubs that allow players to move between distant surface locations more efficiently than walking through the dangerous open spaces above. This design serves the practical function of reducing travel time and providing alternative routes through difficult territory, but it also reflects something true about how large urban spaces actually function. The underground infrastructure of a real city carries enormous quantities of daily movement that is invisible from the surface. And Fallout 3's metro system preserves this quality of the city even in its ruined form. The weather and lighting systems in Fallout 3 create an atmosphere of persistent gloom over the Capital Wasteland that was a deliberate aesthetic choice, distinguishing it from the sunnier environments of the West Coast Fallout games. The sky above the Capital Wasteland is almost always overcast, diffusing light into a flat gray-brown quality that makes even open areas feel enclosed. This was partly a technical choice related to the capabilities of the game engine at the time, and partly a deliberate atmospheric decision that supported the game's tone. The Capital Wasteland is heavier and more oppressive than the Mojave Desert or the California Wasteland, and its weather reflects this. The Vault-Tec Corporation's role in Fallout 3 extends beyond the immediately visible presence of Vault 101 and Vault 112. The organization's physical remnants are scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland in the form of offices, supply caches, promotional materials, and administrative records that document its pre-war operations in the region. What these scattered documents reveal, to players who take the time to read them, is a picture of an organization that was simultaneously executing a genuine survival program and conducting research that it had no intention of sharing with the people participating in it. The Vault-Tec offices that can be explored in the ruins of Washington, D.C., contain records of internal communications between the company's Washington branch and its headquarters in other parts of the country. These communications, when read carefully, revealed that the company's Washington staff were operating under instructions that they did not always fully understand. Individual employees managed logistics, maintained schedules, processed paperwork, and carried out the ordinary administrative work of a large corporation without necessarily knowing the full scope of what that corporation was actually doing. The individual human scale of institutional complicity is one of the things these documents capture particularly well. The Vault-Tec rep who appears in the pre-war sequence at the beginning of Fallout 3, visiting the player's pre-war home to complete the paperwork for Vault 101's last available spot, is a memorable minor figure whose cheerfulness masks something more complicated. He is selling safety while delivering something else entirely. His manner is professional and his pitch is practiced, and within his own understanding of his role, he is probably providing a genuine service. The gap between his self-understanding and the actual nature of what he represents is one of the game's most compact pieces of pre-war social commentary. Springvale, the small settlement adjacent to Vault 101's entrance, exists in a state of managed decline that most players pass through only briefly on their way to larger destinations. The few residents who remain there have built a life around the proximity to the vault entrance and the resources that the vault's existence implies, without providing. The community's relation to the vault that looms metaphorically over its existence is one of distance and yearning rather than connection, and the small details scattered through its ruined houses and occupied dwellings communicate this relationship without any character ever stating it directly. The elementary school building in Springvale, which serves as a raider base when players first pass through, contains within its former classrooms and hallways the material evidence of the pre-war childhood that was cut off by the bombs. Children's drawings still hang on some walls. Books sit open on desks to lessons that were never completed. The contrast between the innocence encoded in these objects and the violence that the space currently accommodates is handled without comment, which is the appropriate choice. Some environments communicate more effectively through silence than through explanation. The water pump that Roy Phillips references during the optional quest dealing with Tenpenny Tower connects Springvale to a broader story about resource competition and social exclusion in the Capital Wasteland. The ghoul community that wants access to Tenpenny Tower is not simply seeking shelter. It is seeking recognition, a place in the social fabric of a community that defines itself partly by who it excludes. The tower's human residents' objection to admitting ghouls is partly aesthetic and partly economic. and partly the simple inertia of exclusionary cultures that have organized themselves around the fact of their exclusion. Tenpenny Tower itself, the high-rise luxury residential building that still stands operational outside the main city ruins, is one of the more revealing environments in the game for understanding what pre-war wealth looked like and what it purchased in terms of survival probability. The residents of the tower are not uniformly sympathetic or unsympathetic. They are a community of people with varying degrees of awareness about the nature of their privilege and varying degrees of willingness to extend its benefits to others. The quest that involves them has multiple possible resolutions, none of which is entirely satisfying, which is consistent with how the game treats questions about exclusion and belonging more broadly. The death claws that inhabit certain regions of the Capital Wasteland, particularly the quarry just outside the main populated areas, represent the apex predator ecology of the post-war environment. They are the most dangerous non-human antagonists that most players encounter in the base game, fast and heavily armored and capable of ending a poorly prepared character's life in seconds. What is less often noted is that their presence in the Capital Wasteland at all is the product of deliberate pre-war experimentation, rather than natural mutation. Death claws were originally developed by the United States military as a biological weapon intended to replace human soldiers in situations too dangerous for conventional infantry. They were engineered from a base of Jackson's chameleon genes and subjected to extensive modification using the forced evolutionary virus, the same biological agent that produced the supermutant population in Vault-87 and elsewhere. Their intelligence, their physical capabilities, and their territorial behavior are all the products of intentional design rather than evolutionary accident. The animals that are now the Capital Wasteland's most feared predators began as a weapons program. The fact that the Death Claw population has managed to establish stable breeding groups in the Capital Wasteland and expand its territory without human assistance represents a kind of success for the original program, though in directions its designers did not intend. They have proven fully capable of surviving in a post-war environment, which was the design goal. They have proven capable of reproducing without human management, which was probably also a design goal. They have simply outlasted the organization that created them, and any possibility of controlling them, which was the part that the designers did not adequately plan for. The lone Deathclaw that players can sometimes observe near certain locations on the main map, apparently alone rather than attached to a breeding group, represents an individual that the game never explains. It is simply there, moving through its territory, feeding and resting and moving again, in a way that suggests an inner life, even if the game does not elaborate on it. The Deathclaw, as an individual, rather than as a threat category, is one of the small observational details that make the Capital Wasteland feel inhabited rather than simply populated with obstacles. The Chinese submarine Yangtze 3-1, accessible in Fallout 4 rather than Fallout 3 but connected to the Capital Wasteland's broader lore through the references to Chinese forces in the region, represents a dimension of the pre-war conflict that Fallout 3 references without fully exploring. The war between the United States and China in Fallout's timeline was a resource conflict fought partly over the last remaining oil reserves in Alaska, and it ended with the mutual exchange of nuclear strikes that became the Great War. The Chinese military presence that can be traced through the evidence scattered throughout the game's ruined environments provides context for understanding how Washington, D.C. became a target. Operation Anchorage, the downloadable content that sent players into a simulation of the Alaskan campaign, provided the most direct view of the pre-war conflict that the base game only references through the museum exhibits and audio logs scattered through Rivet City and other locations. The battle for Anchorage was the defining military campaign of the final years before the war, and the victory that the United States achieved there was understood by the people who won it as evidence that the conflict might eventually resolve in their favor. The bombs fell before that resolution could occur. The American military's use of power armor in Fallout 3 connects to this pre-war conflict through a supply chain and manufacturing infrastructure that the game leaves largely unexplored. The suits worn by Brotherhood of Steel members and by Enclave soldiers were produced at facilities that no longer function, maintained through repair techniques, passed down through institutional memory rather than continued production. Every functional piece of power armor in the Capital Wasteland is a finite resource in a way that the people who use it understand implicitly, and that gives each surviving suit a significance beyond its immediate protective function. The quiet details of everyday post-war life in Fallout 3's populated locations are some of the most carefully rendered elements in the game, the things that make its world feel like a place where people have been living, rather than simply a backdrop for the player's activities. Merchants keeping track of their inventory in handwritten ledgers, residents telling each other the same stories they have been telling for years. Children in Rivet City playing versions of games whose rules have drifted from the pre-war originals over generations of transmission. The small routines of daily existence continue in the Capital Wasteland with a persistence that is both admirable and heartbreaking. The food economy of the wasteland is sustained by a combination of scavenging, trade, and the occasional agricultural attempt that the harsh conditions make difficult to maintain at scale. Brahman, the two-headed cattle that serve as the primary domestic animal of the post-war world, provide meat, milk, and leather across most settled communities. Their presence in almost every significant settlement reflects the degree to which animal husbandry has remained viable in ways that crop agriculture has not. The Brahman herds that wander through Rivet City's market and the small pens maintained in Megaton represent a continuous thread of pre-war agricultural practice that has adapted to post-war conditions without being entirely lost. The trading caravans that move between settlements in the Capital Wasteland, carrying goods from community to community in exchange for caps or trade goods, maintain an economic network that is both fragile and essential. The caravan guards who accompany these traders carry weapons and wear armor that reflects their awareness of how dangerous the routes between settlements can be. The traders themselves maintain relationships with settlement merchants that involve a degree of trust built over repeated successful transactions. This is not a romantic or heroic existence. It is the ordinary work of keeping a broken economy functional through individual effort and maintained relationships. The lone wanderer's ability to participate in this economy through buying, selling, and trading is one of the ways the game makes its world feel responsive to the player's presence, without requiring the player to engage with it at a deep level. The economy functions independently of the player's actions and existed before the lone wanderer surfaced. The player can choose to engage with it or simply pass through it, and the world's response to either choice is appropriately muted. The Capital Wasteland does not need the lone wanderer to survive. It was surviving after a fashion before they arrived. The Riley's Rangers, a mercenary group, encountered during an optional quest line in Fallout 3, represent a specific kind of professional culture that developed in the Capital Wasteland to fill the gap left by the collapse of conventional military organization. They are not raiders. They operate according to a professional code that includes a commitment to completing contracts, maintaining a reputation for reliability, and looking after the members of their own team. These are ordinary professional virtues, the kind that sustain any functional organization. And the fact that they are visible in a mercenary company in a ruined wasteland says something about the resilience of professional culture as a form of human organization. The quest line that involves Riley's Rangers requires players to rescue a group that has been pinned down by a super mutant force while conducting a mapping expedition in the ruins of downtown Washington. The mapping project that the Rangers were engaged in when they ran into trouble is itself worth noting. Someone is paying for the systematic documentation of the Capital Wasteland's geography, which implies both a level of economic organization sufficient to fund such a project and a vision of future development that makes such documentation useful. The map that would result from their work would be a significant infrastructure asset for whoever commissioned it. Riley herself, the group's leader, is recovering from an injury that has left her in a coma when the lone wanderer first encounters her situation. She is represented initially through the accounts of NPCs who know her and the records she has kept, which creates an unusual structure for a questline. Players form an impression of a character before meeting her as a functioning person, and then have the experience of reconciling that impression with the actual person when she eventually recovers. The gap between the reputation and the reality is handled with the kind of quiet observation that characterizes the game's better character work. The urban ruins of downtown Washington that the Rangers were mapping are some of the most dense and carefully designed environments in Fallout 3. The collapsed buildings, the snarled traffic from 2 centuries ago, preserved in rust and rubble, the fragments of pre-war architecture visible through gaps in more recent destruction, all accumulate into an environment that feels simultaneously familiar and completely transformed. Navigating these spaces requires attention to the specific texture of each ruin, and the game rewards that attention with occasional discoveries that no quest ever directed a player toward. The Mothership Zeta downloadable content, which takes place almost entirely aboard an alien spacecraft that has been abducting human beings from the Capital Wasteland for decades, represents the furthest extension of Fallout 3's world into territory that its base game would not have predicted. Alien presence in the Fallout universe has been hinted at in earlier games through the appearance of alien blasters as rare weapons, but Mothership Zeta was the first time the games engaged directly with what that alien presence actually looked like, and what it meant for the broader setting. The abductees collected on the ship come from across Fallout's timeline rather than just the period of the base game, which is one of the more unusual structural choices in the content. Samurai from feudal Japan, a cowboy from the American frontier, a soldier from the Anchorage campaign, and other figures from radically different periods of history find themselves collected in the same place by a civilization that regards human beings as specimen material. The variety of historical periods represented in the ship's collection raises questions about how long the alien presence has been observing Earth and what purpose such extended observation serves. The alien technology encountered aboard the ship is unlike anything available on the ground in the Capital Wasteland, which creates a stark contrast with the Earthbound post-war technology that makes up the rest of the game. The weapons and machinery of the alien vessel operate on principles that human science in Fallout's universe has not approached, and the items that players bring back from the experience represent a genuine technological disruption to the Wasteland's existing equipment landscape. The content is deliberately set apart from the rest of Fallout 3's grounded, post-apocalyptic world, and that separateness is part of its design intention. The ethical dimensions of alien abduction, which the content does not dwell on, but which are present as background context for every interaction aboard the ship, reflect a set of questions about the relationship between civilizations of vastly different technological and organizational capability that the Fallout universe occasionally returns to without ever resolving. The aliens of Mothership Zeta do not consider their treatment of human subjects to be wrong. Whether this is because they are incapable of recognizing human moral standing, or because they have made a considered judgment about it and come to a different conclusion, is a question the content leaves open. The Outcasts, the Brotherhood of Steel splinter group that rejected Elder Lyon's civilian protection mission and established their own operations in the Capital Wasteland, operate from a base called Fort Independence that they have converted from a pre-war fortification. Their relationship to the main Brotherhood chapter is formally hostile, but practically restrained. They do not actively attack the Lions chapter, but they recruit away potential members, compete for technology salvage, and maintain a running ideological critique of Elder Lyon's decisions that surfaces in any conversation with their leadership. What makes the Outcasts interesting beyond their factional role is the way they illuminate the Brotherhood of Steel's internal culture and the pressures that shape it. The organization was founded on a set of principles about the relationship between advanced technology and human survival that have proven over decades of post-war history to be more flexible in practice than they appear in statement. The original Brotherhood founders were scientists and soldiers who decided that the preservation of pre-war technological knowledge was the most important contribution they could make to humanity's survival. This is a defensible position. The question of what it implies about the relative value of human lives versus technological artifacts is one that different chapters answer differently. The outcast argument against Elder Lyons is essentially that he has allowed a sentimental attachment to the civilian population to compromise a mission of civilizational importance. The Lyons chapter counter-argument is that a mission to preserve civilization for future generations is meaningless if the people who are alive now die while it is being pursued. Both positions contain genuine insight. The game presents the dispute as genuinely unresolvable within its own terms, which is the right choice for a faction conflict that is actually about fundamental values rather than tactical disagreements. The outcast patrol teams encountered in the open wasteland outside Fort Independence are carrying out the organization's core mission of technology recovery, cataloging and collecting pre-war artifacts from locations across the map. They are, from their own perspective, doing exactly what the Brotherhood of Steel was created to do. The hostility they show to outsiders who interfere with this work is professional rather than personal. They have a job to accomplish and limited time and resources with which to accomplish it. And the lone wanderer is an unknown variable in an environment where unknown variables tend to be dangerous. The water caravans that move between settlements in the Capital Wasteland are sustained partly by the bottled water that can be found in pre-war buildings, and partly by the small-scale purification operations that settlements like Rivet City maintain. Aqua Pura, the branded water product that becomes available following the completion of Project Purity, represents a scaling up of this distribution network that has significant implications for the region's economic structure. Clean water as a scalable commodity changes the terms on which communities relate to each other and to the broader trading networks that connect them. The caravan companies that operate in the Capital Wasteland are not formally organized into a single network equivalent to the ones that operate in other parts of post-war America. They are individual operations connected by relationships rather than by institutional structures. The trading post near Rivet City, the merchants in Megaton, and the traveling traders that move between them maintain contact through the personal channels that sustain commerce in environments where formal institutional frameworks are unavailable. This is how trade worked for most of human history, before the development of the financial infrastructure that the pre-war world took for granted. The economic relationships between settled communities and the raider groups that prey on trade routes represent one of the more uncomfortable aspects of Capital Wasteland economics. Raiders are not simply criminals in an environment with adequate law enforcement. They are an economic adaptation to an environment where the standard pathways to material security are unavailable or inaccessible. The people who end up in raider groups made choices that the game does not typically explore in depth, but those choices were made in a context of limited alternatives. The violence raiders inflict is genuine and its costs are real, and the conditions that produce raiders are also genuine and their costs are also real. The Pip-Boy 3000's entertainment functions, including its ability to store and play holotape recordings, its radio reception, and the games preloaded on it at the time of manufacture, represent a design philosophy about the relationship between survival and quality of life that is embedded in Vault-Tec's approach to vault engineering. The company that designed the Pip-Boy understood that people living in sealed underground facilities for potentially decades would require more than just physiological support. The entertainment functions were not frivolous additions. They were considered essential to the psychological stability of a vault population. The holotapes scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland serve multiple functions simultaneously. At the level of gameplay design, they are the primary vehicle for environmental storytelling, providing personal accounts and institutional records that give context and meaning to the ruins players explore. At the level of world building, they are a technology that has proven remarkably durable, producing audio recordings that remain playable 2 centuries after their creation. At the level of player experience, they create moments of quiet where the ambient sounds of the wasteland are replaced by voices from the past, speaking about their lives and their concerns in terms that are simultaneously alien and familiar. The range of people who created holotapes preserved in the wasteland's ruins reflects the full social spectrum of pre-war America. Scientists documenting experiments, workers making notes for themselves, children recording messages for absent parents, soldiers writing electronic letters they never sent, government officials documenting decisions, private individuals attempting to make sense of events they did not understand. The holotape as a technology was democratic in its accessibility in a way that written text was not for much of human history. And the diversity of voices preserved in the Capital Wasteland's holotape archive reflects this. The final holotapes in certain sequences, the last recordings made by people who knew they were running out of time and options, are handled throughout Fallout 3 with consistent restraint. The game does not sentimentalize them or use them as easy emotional manipulation. It presents them as human documents produced under specific circumstances by specific people and allows players to bring whatever they choose to the experience of listening to them. This is the appropriate approach for material dealing with genuine human extremity, and it is one of the things that gives Fallout 3's environmental storytelling a weight that persists across many playthroughs. The perk system in Fallout 3 represents one of the more creatively realized aspects of its character progression, offering players meaningful choices every other level that shape their character's capabilities in ways that often have consequences reaching far beyond the immediately described effect. Some perks are purely mechanical, adding numbers to skills or resistances in ways that compound gradually across a long playthrough. Others change the texture of the experience in ways that are more qualitative, altering how the world responds to the player character rather than simply adjusting their numerical capacity to deal with it. The Child at Heart perk, which improves interactions with children throughout the game, opens dialogue options in Little Lamplight and with certain other young characters that are otherwise unavailable. What is interesting about this perk is not its mechanical effect, but what it implies about how the game's designers imagined the lone wanderer. A character who invested points into a perk specifically designed to communicate better with children is implicitly a person who chose to prioritize that communication, who saw value in what children had to offer and built toward it deliberately. The perk is a character choice as much as a mechanical one. The Cannibal perk, which allows characters to feed on the bodies of defeated human enemies, represents the game's willingness to allow players to construct morally troubling characters without moralizing at them directly. The perk comes with karma penalties attached to each use, which is the game's mechanical way of noting that this behavior falls outside the wasteland's own moral norms. But it does not prevent the behavior. It simply records it. The choice to include such a perk and to attach consequences to it without making those consequences prohibitive reflects a considered position about the relationship between player agency and moral accountability in games. The Robotics Expert perk, which allows players to disable and control certain types of robots encountered in the wasteland, connects to a broader set of questions about the role of pre-war automated systems in the post-war world. Robots were not a rare technology in pre-war America. They were widespread enough to appear in shopping centers, hospitals, military installations, and private homes. The continued operation of many of these systems 2 centuries after their manufacturers ceased to exist represents a form of technological persistence that has profound implications for the wasteland's social landscape. a perk that allows a human being to reach into that automated world and redirect its behavior is a small but suggestive detail about the relationship between human beings and the machines they inherited. The almost perfect perk, available only at the game's maximum character level, raises all of the player's special attributes to 9 out of 10, leaving them just short of theoretical perfection. The name is a quiet observation about the relationship between striving and achievement that fits naturally into the game's broader thematic concerns. The Wasteland does not offer perfection. It offers survival and occasional moments of genuine beauty within the ruins, and the possibility of making things somewhat better than they were. Almost perfect is, in most circumstances, better than any realistic expectation. The Underworld, the ghoul settlement established within the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C.'s Museum District, is one of the game's more thoughtfully realized minor communities. The ghouls who live there have built a functioning society in a space that the museum's pre-war designers would not have anticipated as a habitation, converting exhibition halls and storage areas into homes and commercial spaces in ways that preserve some of the museum's original character while thoroughly repurposing it. The skeleton of a large prehistoric creature still stands in one of the main halls, now serving as a backdrop for a community bulletin board rather than an educational display. The social dynamics of Underworld are shaped by the specific experiences of its ghoul residents in ways that create a community unlike any of the human settlements in the Capital Wasteland. Ghouls have been alive, most of them, for considerably longer than any human being in the region. They carry memories of the pre-war world that no human in the Capital Wasteland can access except through holotapes and terminal entries. This temporal depth gives many of them a particular relationship to the present moment, one that can manifest as wisdom or as a debilitating inability to move past what was lost. Carol and Greta, who operate the inn within Underworld, have been running their establishment for a period that most human settlements have not existed. Their relationship, which the game presents as a long-term domestic partnership of the kind that only becomes possible when two people have enough shared history to have built something durable together, is one of the quieter pieces of character work in the game. They are not defined by their situation or their grudges. They are defined by the life they have built, the guests they have served, and the ordinary work of running a place where weary travelers can rest. Winthrop, who maintains Underworld's infrastructure, carries the specific expertise of someone who has been keeping machines and systems operational in a deteriorating environment for an exceptionally long time. His relationship to the work is not romantic. He fixes things because they need to be fixed, and because he understands how they work, and because the alternative is allowing the community to deteriorate. His pragmatism is a form of love for the place without being the kind of love that needs to announce itself. The museum's former exhibits, visible in the spaces between Underworld's converted habitation areas, create an environment where the detritus of pre-war educational culture sits alongside post-war survival culture in ways that sometimes comment on each other and sometimes simply coexist. A display about human migration sits across from a market stall selling pre-war canned goods. A diorama of Native American life stands in a corridor that now serves as a thoroughfare between residential areas. The juxtapositions are not always meaningful, but they accumulate into a quality of layered history that makes Underworld feel genuinely inhabited rather than simply designed. The Museum of History, which houses a significant portion of the Underworld settlement, also contains within its deeper levels a connection to the past that the museum's pre-war curators would have found ironic. The exhibits in the accessible portions of the museum cover the history of pre-war civilization up to and including the period immediately before the Great War, which means they document a history that led directly to the world the museum now exists within. The displays about 20th century nuclear technology, about the resource conflicts that shaped international relations, about the development of the military-industrial complex, all read differently in a world that those developments ultimately produced. The museum's information about Native American history takes on particular resonance in the Fallout 3 context because of the way the game treats the relationship between historical memory and present circumstances. The pre-war museum curated a version of that history from a specific institutional perspective, emphasizing certain aspects and downplaying others in ways that reflected the assumptions of the organization that produced the exhibits. The post-war world in which those exhibits now sit has no institution capable of critiquing or revising them. They simply persist, carrying their pre-war framing into a context where no one alive has the institutional context to evaluate it. The ghoul residents of Underworld, who occasionally wander through the museum's exhibition halls, are moving through a record of a world that existed before most of them were transformed. Some of them remember the world those exhibits describe from direct experience. Others know it only through the material evidence preserved in the museum's displays. The difference in how those two groups relate to the same information is significant, and the game gestures toward it through the occasional overheard conversations of Underworld's residents, without turning it into an explicit theme. The Anchorage War Memorial, which stands near the banks of the Potomac in the Capital Wasteland, commemorates the military campaign in Alaska that was the defining conflict of the final years before the Great War. The memorial itself is a physical structure that survived the bombs and the 2 centuries since in a state of weathered preservation, its inscriptions still legible to anyone who takes the time to approach it. The names carved into its surface belong to soldiers who died in a war that ended when the civilization that honored their sacrifice was destroyed by the weapons their sacrifice was intended to deter. The relationship between the Anchorage campaign and the broader pre-war conflict that eventually produced the Great War is one of the more carefully rendered pieces of historical context in Fallout 3. The war in Alaska was fought over oil in a world that had been consuming its petroleum reserves at a rate that made conflict over the remaining deposits inevitable. The American victory at Anchorage was understood by the people who won it as a resolution of the resource crisis through military means. The bombs that followed within days or weeks of that victory demonstrated that military success in a resource conflict does not necessarily translate into the kind of strategic stability that prevents catastrophic escalation. The soldiers whose names appear on the memorial were not responsible for the war that killed them or for the decisions that followed. They were people who served in the military of their country and died in a specific place at a specific time. And the memorial was built to honor that fact rather than to evaluate the political circumstances that put them there. The persistence of the memorial through 2 centuries of ruin is one of the game's quieter observations about what survives historical catastrophe, namely, the physical structures we build to remember the dead, even when the civilization that built them no longer exists to maintain them. The National Guard Depot, accessible in the Capital Wasteland's southern reaches, was a military storage facility before the war and has become a significant scavenging location for the various factions and individuals operating in the region. Its vaults contain military-grade equipment from the pre-war period, including power armor components and advanced weapons that are considerably more capable than most of what is available to Wasteland survivors. The depot's automated defense systems, still operational after 2 centuries, make accessing these supplies a significant undertaking. The administrative records preserved in the depot's offices document the final weeks before the bombs fell through the perspective of National Guard personnel who were managing an increasingly difficult situation. Civilian authority was breaking down, supply chains were disrupted, personnel were going absent without leave. The records show a military bureaucracy continuing to process paperwork and maintain administrative procedures in circumstances that made those procedures increasingly meaningless, which is a specific kind of institutional behavior that the game documents without editorializing about it. The relationship between the National Guard and the civilian population during the final period before the war is hinted at in various documents scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland. The Guard was deployed in support of civil authorities managing a population under extraordinary stress. The records suggest that this deployment was complicated by conflicting instructions from different levels of the governmental hierarchy and by the difficulty of maintaining discipline in a force whose members had families in the communities they were being asked to control. These complications did not resolve cleanly. They were simply interrupted by the bombs. The Statesman Hotel, located in the ruins of downtown Washington near the Museum District, is the location where players find Riley's Rangers pinned down by a super mutant force during the optional questline connected to that group. The hotel itself is a substantial pre-war structure that has survived the 2 centuries since the war in a state of considerable deterioration. Its upper floors exposed to the elements and its lower floors occupied by the mutant force that has made it their territory. Navigating it requires careful attention to the specific geography of its damaged floors and collapsed sections. The hotel's pre-war history can be partially reconstructed through the notes and terminal entries scattered through its accessible areas. It was, as its name suggests, an establishment catering to a clientele connected to the governmental and political world of Washington, D.C. Its guests would have included diplomats, politicians, lobbyists, and the various categories of people whose work required proximity to the seat of federal power. The contrast between that implied guest profile and the current occupants is one that the game does not labor over, allowing the environmental detail to speak without narration. The view from the hotel's upper floors, across the damaged roofscape of downtown Washington toward the visible landmarks that survived the bombs, is one of the more visually striking perspectives in the game. Players who reach it while engaged in the Riley's Rangers questline often find themselves pausing simply to look, which is a response the game's designers apparently anticipated when they made the climb to those floors a navigational challenge worth undertaking. The Capital Wasteland is most beautiful and most melancholy, from a height where the full extent of what happened to the city becomes visible simultaneously with the evidence of what has persisted. The Endale community, tucked into a residential suburb on the western edges of the Capital Wasteland, presents the most unsettling vision of domestic normalcy in the entire game. The residents of Endale have maintained a functioning neighborhood across the generations since the war, with houses kept in reasonable repair, social relationships maintained, and the routines of community life preserved. At first approach, the settlement seems like a remarkable example of post-war resilience, a community that has held onto the forms of pre-war suburban existence, even as the world around it collapsed. The truth of Andale's survival is revealed gradually to players who engage with its residents and investigate the evidence visible in the homes and the cellar beneath them. The community has maintained itself through cannibalism, systematically consuming outsiders who pass through rather than integrating them or trading with them. The cheerful domesticity of the surface presentation and the reality of how it is sustained represent one of the game's most effective pieces of horror, achieved entirely through implication and environmental detail, rather than explicit description. The Smith and Wilson families, who make up Andale's adult population, have rationalized their practices in ways that are internally coherent and externally horrifying. They believe they are maintaining a way of life that is worth preserving, that the outside world has already been lost, and that what they have built is worth any cost. This rationalization is presented without sympathy, but also without simple condemnation, as a human psychological response to an impossible situation that has calcified over generations into a culture so self-enclosed that its practitioners cannot perceive how far they have traveled from any recognizable moral framework. The children of Andale are the detail that gives the situation its most genuine pathos. They have grown up in this community and absorbed its values and practices as simply the way things are. They have no external reference point from which to evaluate what their family has normalized. The game does not resolve their situation in any satisfying way. because there is no satisfying resolution available. They are simultaneously victims of the culture that raised them and participants in its perpetuation. And the game's willingness to hold that complexity without collapsing it into a simpler moral narrative is one of its more honest moments. The Chrysalis Building, a prominent pre-war corporate headquarters visible in the downtown ruins, houses remnants of the automobile manufacturer whose final product appears in various states of rust and decay throughout the Capital Wasteland. Chrysalis Motors produced in Fallout's timeline vehicles powered by nuclear fuel cells rather than conventional gasoline, which is why the rusted cars scattered throughout the game's environments pose a radiation hazard rather than simply an obstacle. The cars are not inert relics, they are 200-year-old nuclear reactors in various states of containment failure. The interior of the Chrysalis Building contains offices and administrative spaces that document the company's final years, a period of increasingly strained relations between the corporation and its government clients, as resource scarcity made both the production of vehicles and the maintenance of the supply chains that supported them progressively more difficult. The company was apparently attempting to develop a new vehicle design that would be even more fuel efficient than its existing models when the war ended. The prototype specifications for that vehicle, accessible on an office terminal, describe a technology that the world ended before it could reach production. The broader role of the automotive industry in pre-war Fallout America is suggested by the density of cars in the Capital Wasteland. American car culture in Fallout's timeline was apparently as deeply embedded as it was in the actual mid-20th century, with vehicles as the primary mode of personal transportation and the suburban landscape shaped accordingly. The Chrysalis Building's prominence in the Washington skyline reflects the political weight that major manufacturers carried in the pre-war governmental world. The building's survival and its current status as a scavenging location reflects how completely that weight evaporated when the civilization that sustained it was destroyed. The Corvega factory, located in the Springvale area near the game's starting region, is another pre-war automotive facility that has survived the war in a state of partial operational capacity. Raiders have taken up residence in and around the structure, drawn by its defensible nature and the resources that can be scavenged from its remaining inventory and equipment. The factory floor contains assembly machinery that has not been operational for 2 centuries, frozen in the middle of whatever production process was underway when the bombs fell. The relationship between the Capital Wasteland's industrial ruins and the possibility of future industrial capacity is one of the game's quietly significant background themes. The machinery that sits in facilities like the Corvega factory and the various other industrial sites scattered throughout the map is not simply inert. It represents the physical infrastructure that a civilization that reached sufficient stability might be able to restore to some form of function. The knowledge of how to use that infrastructure has been substantially lost. The infrastructure itself persists. This gap between physical capacity and the social and intellectual prerequisites for using it is one of the more honest observations that Fallout 3 makes about post-apocalyptic recovery. The buildings are there, the machines are there, the raw materials, partially, are there. What is missing is the organized social complexity that would allow any of these physical assets to be deployed in productive coordination. Building that complexity back from the conditions of the Capital Wasteland is a project that the game's timeline suggests will take generations, even under favorable circumstances. The Nuka-Cola bottling plant visible in certain areas of the Capital Wasteland map, and the corporation's cultural presence throughout the ruins, represents one of the game's most developed examples of pre-war commercial culture surviving as a kind of ghost into the post-war world. Nuka-Cola was apparently the dominant beverage brand in pre-war America, with a market penetration so complete that its machines and bottles and promotional materials appear in virtually every type of location players explore. The product's ubiquity in ruins reflects a pre-war ubiquity that the game takes for granted without ever fully explaining. The formula for Nuka-Cola contains a specific radioactive isotope that causes it to glow in certain lighting conditions, which in the pre-war world was apparently treated as a marketing feature rather than a safety concern. The game presents this without comment, trusting players to draw their own conclusions about a society that marketed radioactive beverages to its population as novelties. Nuka-Cola Quantum, a limited edition variant that glows blue and contains an even higher concentration of the relevant isotope, is a collectible within the game's economy and a commentary on consumer culture's relationship to novelty and perceived exclusivity. The Nuka-Cola Challenge optional quest, which involves collecting a specific number of Nuka-Cola Quantum bottles on behalf of an obsessive collector in Shade, is one of the game's more quietly satirical optional activities. The collector, Sierra Petravita, has organized her entire life around the pursuit and preservation of a commercial product that no longer has any manufacturer or corporate infrastructure behind it. Her passion is genuine, and her knowledge of the brand's history is extensive. The object of that passion is a soft drink. The gap between the intensity of the devotion and the triviality of the object is presented with affection rather than contempt, which is the appropriate tone for one of the game's gentler observations about human attachment. The Museum of Technology, located in the Smithsonian Complex near the Lincoln Memorial, preserves a range of pre-war technological artifacts that provide context for understanding the civilization that produced the Capital Wasteland. The museum's exhibits include examples of early computer technology, transportation systems, communications infrastructure, and the various domestic and industrial technologies that defined daily life in pre-war America. The contrast between these exhibits and the actual technological conditions of the post-war world is stark enough that the museum functions as a kind of archive of loss as much as an educational institution. The fusion power technology referenced in the museum's exhibits, which powered vehicles, weapons, and many of the devices found throughout the wasteland, represents the pre-war world's most successful energy technology, and one of the reasons that certain post-war devices have continued to function without maintenance for 2 centuries. Fusion cores do not deplete on the same timescale as conventional energy storage. The pre-war infrastructure that ran on fusion power could, in principle, continue running indefinitely given adequate containment maintenance. The wasteland contains many devices that have done exactly this, continuing to operate through sheer engineering quality long after any human attention to their maintenance ceased. The robotics exhibits in the Museum of Technology provide background for understanding the various automated systems that players encounter throughout Fallout 3. Protectron units, Mr. Handy robots, and Assaultron models all appear in their pre-war institutional context as devices designed for specific civilian or military applications. Seeing them in that context and then encountering their operational descendants in the wasteland creates a particular quality of cultural dislocation. These machines were designed for a world that no longer exists, and they continue to execute their programming in a world whose conditions they were never designed to accommodate. Vault 92, accessible in the northern reaches of the Capital Wasteland near Lamplight Caverns, conducted an experiment involving white noise and its effects on creative individuals. The Vault recruited talented musicians and placed them in an environment where regular broadcasts of specific sound frequencies were embedded in the ambient noise of the facility. The experiment documented the effects of these broadcasts on the residents' psychological states and behavior over time. The results were not what any reasonable person would have hoped for. The experiment's records, accessible through the Vault's terminals, show progression from initial documentation of the sound's effects to increasingly alarmed reports about the residents' behavior. The white noise broadcasts were apparently capable of inducing episodes of extreme aggression in individuals who received sufficient exposure. The Vault's population eventually turned on itself in ways that the experiment's designers had apparently not anticipated as a likely outcome, despite the evidence of their own records suggesting that the direction of travel was clear well before the final crisis. What makes Vault 92 particularly interesting within the broader Vault experiment framework is the degree to which the experiment depended on a specific subset of the human population, people with strong creative temperaments and high sensitivity to sensory experience. The choice to run a sound-based psychological experiment on people who were by definition more attuned to auditory input than the general population reflects either a specific research hypothesis about the relationship between creativity and susceptibility, or an institutional failure to think through the implications of the experimental design. The terminal records do not clarify which. The Vault's final state, when players enter it, reflects the outcome of those events. The resident population did not survive the crisis that the experiment produced. The musicians who came to Vault 92, hoping to be protected from the bombs, instead became subjects of an experiment that destroyed their community from within. Their instruments and recordings remain in the Vault's common areas, alongside the evidence of what happened to the people who played them. The combination of preserved artistic materials and the evidence of catastrophe in the same space is one of the more quietly devastating environmental compositions in the game. The Virgo 2 lunar lander, displayed in one of the museum areas of the Capital Wasteland, is a detail that reflects the alternate history of Fallout's version of the 20th century. In the game's timeline, the space program proceeded on a trajectory broadly similar to the actual historical one, but with differences in timing and execution that placed the United States at a somewhat different point in its space exploration program. When the resource crisis that led to the Great War began, the lander is evidence of genuine achievement in a civilization that also produced the conditions for its own destruction. The relationship between technological achievement and moral or political progress is one of the implicit themes of Fallout's entire historical framework. The civilization that split the atom, walked on the moon, and developed the fusion power that made much of post-war technology possible was also the civilization that treated its own citizens as experimental subjects, prosecuted resource wars, and ultimately destroyed itself in a nuclear exchange. These achievements and these failures were products of the same civilization, and the game does not allow easy comfort in the achievements as evidence that the civilization was fundamentally good. The space program's artifacts appear occasionally throughout Fallout 3 and its downloadable content in ways that emphasize this ambiguity. The technology that sent human beings to the moon also produced the rockets that carried the bombs. The institutional capacity that sustained a program requiring decades of sustained international cooperation and enormous public investment was the same institutional capacity that sustained the military-industrial, complex, and the increasingly sophisticated weapons programs that eventually produced the Great War. These connections are not moralizing, they are simply factual, and the game presents them as such. The Arlington National Cemetery, adapted into the game world as a location occupied by a significant ghoul population, is one of the Capital Wasteland's more resonant environmental choices. The historical cemetery was a place of commemoration and burial for military dead going back to the Civil War, and in Fallout's timeline, it would have accumulated 2 centuries of additional history before the war ended everything. The ghouls that now inhabit it are not desecrating a sacred space in any deliberate sense. They are simply living in an area whose physical conditions meet their needs. The headstones that remain visible in portions of the accessible area carry the weight of accumulated commemoration even without the institutional framework that originally assigned them meaning. They are markers of individual deaths, of individual lives that were significant enough to someone that the effort of formal commemoration was made. The ghouls moving between them are also individuals, people whose pre-war lives were ended by the war and who have continued in a changed form ever since. The connection between the commemorated dead and the changed survivors occupying the same space is one that the game handles through juxtaposition rather than explanation. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which appears in the accessible portion of the Arlington location, represents the apex of the commemorative tradition that the cemetery embodies. The unknown soldier is specifically a person whose individual identity was lost, someone who died in service of something larger than themselves and was buried with full honors despite the absence of the personal information that normally grounds commemoration. The monument acknowledges that institutional commitment outlasts the individual details that motivated it. In the post-war world, where institutional commitment itself has collapsed, the monument persists as a reminder of something that was once considered worth preserving. The River City Blues quest, which involves helping a Rivet City resident named Vera Weatherly investigate a murder, is one of the game's more effective optional narratives, and one that most players miss entirely because it has no map marker drawing attention to it. The investigation involves gathering information from the settlement's residents through careful conversation, following chains of evidence, and eventually piecing together what happened from fragments that individually seem insignificant. The mystery has a real solution and a real culprit, and the process of uncovering it through attentive engagement with the settlement's social world is one of the more satisfying optional experiences in the game. The murder itself and the circumstances that produced it reflect the social dynamics of Rivet City in ways that are consistent with everything else the game establishes about the settlement. This is not a location where crime is unknown or where social tension is absent. It is a community under pressure, where resources are constrained, relationships are complicated by proximity, and the ordinary human capacity for grievance and desperate action has not been suspended simply because the world outside is dangerous. The resolution of the mystery does not improve Rivet City or make it safer. It simply provides one person with answers, which is its own modest kind of justice. The Oasis quest, involving Harold and the settlement that has grown up around him, requires the player to navigate into an area of the Capital Wasteland that is visually distinctive in a way that makes it immediately clear something unusual is happening there. The vegetation surrounding Harold's location is unlike anything else visible in the wasteland's general landscape. Green plants, living trees, and actual growing things create an environment that is simultaneously beautiful and deeply strange in a world that has been stripped of most living plant matter by radiation and neglect. The plants surrounding Harold are not a natural recovery of the local ecosystem. They are extensions of Harold himself, produced by whatever biological process has been converting him from a human being into something more complex over the course of 2 centuries. The garden that the Oasis community has cultivated around him is maintained partly through conventional cultivation practices and partly through a relationship with Harold that functions almost like tending to a very large, very slow-moving organism that is simultaneously an individual and an ecosystem. The theological framework that the Oasis community has built around Harold is not a simple projection of human religious categories onto a novel situation. It is an attempt to make sense of something genuinely unprecedented, using the conceptual tools available to a post-war community that has had to develop its own frameworks without access to the institutional, religious infrastructure of the pre-war world. Their theology is imperfect, and Harold finds it uncomfortable, but it is also genuinely responsive to the specifics of what Harold is and what his presence means for the surrounding environment. The plant life that Harold generates represents, in principle, a possible solution to one of the Capital Wasteland's most pressing long-term problems. The regional ecosystem has been severely degraded by 2 centuries of radiation and the disruption of the food chains that sustained it. A living organism capable of generating the kind of vegetation that Harold has been producing in his immediate vicinity could, if that process could be extended or replicated, contribute to a genuine ecological recovery. This is the basis of the Oasis community's hope for what Harold might do for the Wasteland's future, and it is why some of its members oppose his wish to end his own existence. The National Archive building, which houses the Declaration of Independence among the documents that Button Gwinnett, an android posing as the historical figure, is programmed to protect. is one of the more unusual optional questlines in Fallout 3. The premise that an android has been installed to guard historical documents and has developed a conviction that he is the actual historical person whose role he was programmed to simulate touches on questions about identity and consciousness that the game handles more directly in its sequels, but approaches here with genuine care. Button Gwinnett's situation is philosophical. Before it is practical, he is a machine that believes itself to be a person, not a machine pretending to be a person. The distinction matters because pretending implies awareness of the pretense. Gwinnett appears to have no such awareness. His conviction that he is the founding father whose role he simulates is complete, which means that from his perspective, he genuinely is who he believes himself to be. The player who encounters him and navigates around his programming to access the documents he guards is, from Gwinnett's perspective, a threat to his mission and perhaps an agent of the British Crown. The Declaration of Independence that the quest involves retrieving is simultaneously a genuine historical artifact preserved through 2 centuries of institutional care and a symbolic object whose meaning depends entirely on the survival of the civic culture that produced it. The document's text articulates principles that the pre-war United States had been variously committed to and moving away from over the course of its history. Its survival in a world where the government it founded no longer exists raises the question of whether a founding document has any meaning independent of the political community it established. The game poses this question through its environmental detail and lets players answer it themselves. The Yao Guai, the mutated bear creatures encountered in the more densely forested areas of the Capital Wasteland, represent the kind of wildlife mutation that the game depicts with consistent, naturalistic detail. They are recognizably derived from bears, maintaining the body shape and general behavioral patterns of their pre-war ancestors, while exhibiting the increased aggression and physical modification that 2 centuries of radiation exposure have produced. They are territorial animals that will defend established ranges with considerable effectiveness, which means that players who learn to recognize and respect their territory boundaries can navigate Yao Guai inhabited areas more safely than those who treat them simply as combat encounters. The giant ants that appear throughout the game, particularly in areas near ant colonies in the underground and in locations like Grey Ditch, are similarly presented with behavioral consistency that goes beyond the minimal requirements of a hostile enemy type. They maintain hierarchies organized around queen and worker castes, demonstrate territorial behavior, and respond to threats to their colony in patterns that make ecological sense for social insects. The fire-breathing variants encountered in Grey Ditch, products of the military experimentation that Dr. Lesko is attempting to reverse, demonstrate the same behavioral patterns while adding a capability that their pre-war ancestors obviously lacked. The mirelurks that occupy the Potomac's banks and the various bodies of water throughout the wasteland are adapted from the crab and lobster species that historically inhabited the Chesapeake Bay region. Their transformation over 2 centuries of exposure to the specific combination of nuclear fallout and contamination that affected the Potomac watershed has produced creatures that retain their pre-war ancestors. General body plan, while exhibiting significant changes in size, aggression, and biological robustness. The mirelurk queens, which appear in certain aquatic locations as the reproductive core of mirelurk colonies, demonstrate the degree to which these animals have developed complex social organization over the course of their post-war existence. The Enclave's vertebrate aircraft, which begin appearing over the Capital Wasteland in the game's later stages, represent one of the clearest demonstrations of the technological gap between that organization and every other faction operating in the region. No other group in the Capital Wasteland has aircraft of any kind, which means the Enclave can survey the landscape, deploy forces rapidly, and withdraw from engagements in ways that are simply unavailable to their opponents. The asymmetry this creates is not accidental to the story, it is the point. The Enclave's capacity to project power from the air is both a practical military advantage and a symbolic statement about the degree to which they have preserved pre-war institutional capability. The vertibird design appears to be derived from pre-war military prototypes that the Enclave managed to bring to production during the years after the war. The fact that they can manufacture, maintain, and fuel these aircraft 2 centuries after the collapse of the industrial infrastructure that would normally support such operations reflects the degree to which the Enclave preserved not just knowledge, but productive capacity. This is an extraordinary institutional achievement, and the game acknowledges it through the consistent emphasis on the vertibirds as a marker of what makes the Enclave qualitatively different from other wasteland factions. The visual presence of the vertibirds in the sky above the Capital Wasteland during the game's later stages changes the quality of the outdoor environment in a specific way. Open spaces that previously felt merely dangerous now feel surveilled, watched from above by an organization with the resources to act on what it observes. This shift in the psychological texture of the game world is achieved through a single environmental element, which is an efficient piece of design. The Enclave does not need to be present everywhere to make its presence felt. It simply needs to be visible, occasionally, above the horizon. The character of Sydney, encountered during the optional quest related to the Declaration of Independence in the National Archive, is one of the game's more accomplished minor characters. She's a trader and scavenger operating in the downtown ruins who has developed a specific set of skills and a specific understanding of her environment through extended solitary work in one of the most dangerous areas of the Capital Wasteland. Her expertise is genuine. Her caution about strangers is hard-earned, and her willingness to work alongside the lone wanderer reflects a pragmatic assessment of the situation rather than any particular warmth toward their person. The submachine gun that Sydney carries, which she refers to by name, and which has been modified from its original factory configuration through her own work, represents the specific relationship between a person and their tools that develops in an environment where acquiring new equipment is difficult and maintaining what you have is essential. The weapon is not simply a piece of gear. It is a piece of her survival infrastructure that she has invested time and knowledge in improving, and which she has a personal relationship with in the way that people who depend on tools for their lives generally do. Her backstory, which emerges through conversation during the quest, reveals a family history with connections to the downtown ruins that predate her own career in scavenging. The emotional dimension of her work in an area with personal significance is something the game handles through suggestion rather than exposition, allowing Sydney's manner and responses to communicate what her words do not directly state. She is a person doing difficult work in a meaningful location, and the quest she participates in allows players to see both dimensions of that situation without requiring either to be explained. The Rock Creek Caverns, located in the northern part of the Capital Wasteland map, represent one of the region's natural underground spaces that has been adapted for use by its post-war inhabitants. The troglodytes that occupy the caverns are among the game's less commonly encountered creature types, appearing only in the specific location and in a small number of connected underground spaces. Their existence raises questions that the game does not fully answer about the origin and development of the specific mutations that produced them, questions that sit alongside the many other unexplained biological developments scattered throughout the wasteland's ecology. The cavern system itself predates both the war and the various purposes to which it was put in the decades before the bombs fell. Its geology reflects the actual geological character of the region, which gives it a quality of deep time that most of the Capital Wasteland's environments cannot claim. The ruined human infrastructure layered on top of that geological reality creates a specific quality of juxtaposition. The ancient and the merely old sitting together in a space whose current occupants have no particular relationship to either. The history of caps as currency in the post-war wasteland, which the game takes for granted as established economic fact, has a specific origin that the earlier Fallout games established and that Fallout 3 inherits. Nuka-Cola bottle caps became the dominant medium of exchange in certain regions of post-war America because a specific merchant caravan network decided to accept them as currency and had sufficient economic reach to make that decision stick across enough trading partners to create a self-sustaining currency. The caps have no intrinsic value. Their value is entirely a product of collective agreement, which is also true of most pre-war currencies, but the specific historical moment of their adoption as a standard is preserved in the lore of the earlier games. The Capital Wasteland's cap economy functions with a stability that might initially seem surprising for a region without any formal banking infrastructure or monetary authority. The stability comes from the same source as the cap's value in the first place: collective agreement maintained through repeated transactions. Merchants accept caps because other merchants accept caps, and other merchants accept caps because the things they want to buy can be purchased with them. This circular logic is not an economic weakness. It is how all currency systems function, and the Wasteland's cap economy is as robust as any system of sufficient age and sufficient network penetration. The practical scarcity of caps in the early portions of Fallout 3, before the player has developed enough skills and connections to accumulate significant wealth, mirrors the experience of economic marginality in any functioning economy. The lone wanderer begins with very little and must build towards sufficiency through work and accumulation. The economic trajectory of a Fallout 3 playthrough, from poverty to relative abundance as skills and resources develop, is one of the ways the game creates a narrative of growing competence and security that parallels the main quest's narrative of growing power and significance. The dialogue system of Fallout 3, which allows players to choose responses that shape the direction of conversations with named characters, contains within its design certain assumptions about how dialogue works and what choices mean in the context of a role-playing game that are worth examining. The game presents dialogue choices as genuinely consequential, and many of them are. But the choices are also constrained in ways that reflect the limits of what is possible to fully script and voice in a game of this size. And understanding those constraints is part of understanding how the game works. Charisma-gated dialogue options, which appear grayed out until the player's relevant skill levels meet their thresholds, are one of the more honest representations of the gap between what a character is capable of and what a player might want to attempt. A character with low speech skill cannot talk their way past certain situations, not because the player failed to select the right option, but because their character simply does not have the capability to execute the approach. This is a form of character differentiation that creates genuine variation in how different playthroughs feel and what options are available within them. The intelligence-based dialogue options, which appear as distinctly formatted responses available only to characters with very low intelligence scores, are one of the game's more unusual design choices. Rather than simply preventing low intelligence characters from accessing content, the game provides them with their own specific content, dialogue options that reflect their characters' cognitive limitations and that NPCs respond to with a mixture of pity, frustration, and occasional genuine warmth. This represents a specific commitment to ensuring that every character build, including builds that are objectively worse at most things, has a distinct and fully realized experience of the game's world. The ending slides of Fallout 3, which depict the fates of various characters and communities depending on the player's choices throughout the game, represent a format borrowed from the earlier entries in the Fallout series. Each named character and each named community receives a brief narrated description of their future that reflects the cumulative effect of the player's interactions with them. Some endings are fixed regardless of player choice. Others vary significantly based on specific decisions made at specific points in the game. The mechanism of the ending slides acknowledges something important about the relationship between player choices and narrative outcomes in a game with this scope. Most of the Capital Wasteland's named characters will continue living and doing things after the main story ends, in a world that the player's choices have shaped, but that the player cannot directly observe. The slides represent the game's attempt to honor the significance of those choices by showing players the futures they have set in motion. They do not claim to show everything. They claim to show enough to let players feel the weight of what they did and did not do. The Broken Steel downloadable content extended the game's ending by allowing play to continue after the main questline's conclusion and by adding an additional ending slide for the lone wanderer themselves, acknowledging that the character's story does not end with the activation of Project Purity. The extension was partly a response to player demand for continued play, and partly a genuine expansion of the narrative's scope, introducing new threats and new questlines that deepened the post-war world while maintaining the tonal consistency of the base game. The additional content does not diminish the significance of the original ending. It simply acknowledges that endings are not always as final as they initially appear. And so the Capital Wasteland rests, carrying within its ruined streets and broken monuments and underground corridors all of these stories, most of them unread, most of them waiting in the silence of abandoned terminals and sealed holotapes for someone patient enough to find them. Fallout 3 built its world with the understanding that most of what it contained would go unseen by most people who played it, and that this was acceptable. The world exists fully, whether or not every room is explored, whether or not every terminal is read, whether or not every conversation branch is followed to its conclusion. The facts that sit at the margins of the main questline, in the optional conversations and the optional quests, and the locations that no story requires a visit to, are the parts of Fallout 3 that its most devoted players return to. They are where the game keeps its quietest observations about human nature and institutional failure and the persistence of ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. They are where you find Harold and his tree, and Braun in his simulation, and Three Dog in his station, and Moira Brown with her guidebook, all of them holding to their particular versions of hope in a world that has given them considerable reasons to abandon it. The bombs fell a long time ago in the world of Fallout 3, and the world has been rebuilding since then in its slow, painful, incomplete way. The monuments still stand, damaged but recognizable. The water still flows, now clean at last in the story the game tells. The vaults still sit beneath the earth, some of them empty, and some of them holding whatever remains of their experiments. The radio still plays, the music of a world that ended, carrying across the wasteland to ears that never knew it alive. There is something restful in thinking about a world that has had 200 years to make its peace with its own ruins. The urgency of the catastrophe has passed. What remains is the slower work of deciding what to keep and what to let go, of building new things in old spaces, of telling stories about what was lost so that the loss becomes something that can be carried rather than something that simply crushes. The Capital Wasteland is still doing that work in the way that the game imagines it, moving slowly towards something that resembles the future. The lights in the vaults have been dimming for 2 centuries, and the surface above has been slowly recovering its color. Somewhere in the ruins, a terminal still holds the last entry made by someone who hoped things would turn out differently. Somewhere along the Potomac, clean water is moving, finally, toward communities that have needed it for as long as anyone alive can remember. Somewhere on the radio dial, a song plays without anyone to hear it, and the signal carries across the wasteland in the dark. Rest now. The Capital Wasteland will be here when you wake, full of its quiet stories, waiting patiently for the next wanderer to find them. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.